Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete and peaceful journey through one of history's most quietly remarkable lives, the life of Princess Louisa of Great Britain, the youngest daughter of a great king, who crossed the cold grey waters of the North Sea as a young woman of 18 and stepped into a foreign land, a foreign language and a foreign court, determined to make it her home. We'll softly explore the arc of her remarkable years, from her first breath in a grand London townhouse surrounded by the hum of royal politics, through her tender childhood in the palaces of Georgian England, her extraordinary marriage journey across the continent, her years as crown princess navigating a strict and austere Danish court, and finally her transformation into one of the most beloved queens Denmark had ever known. A queen who chose to speak the language of her people, raise her children in their tongue, throw open the palace doors, fill the halls with music and laughter, and in doing so, win the hearts of an entire nation. We'll gently arrive at the final sorrowful chapter of her story, the story of a life cut heartbreakingly short at only 27 years of age, and will reflect on the extraordinary legacy she left behind, a legacy so powerful that even after her death, the people of Denmark continued to hold her memory as a golden ideal against which all queens who followed would be measured. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which part of Louisa's story you found most moving, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 18th century Europe lull you into restful sleep. If you are new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Louisa, later known as Queen Louise of Denmark and Norway, drew her first breath on a cold December evening in the year 1724. In a grand townhouse nestled in the heart of Westminster, London. The house was called Leicester House, and though it sat on a fashionable square in one of the finest parts of the city, it carried within its walls a particular kind of tension, the tension of a family divided, of a father and son locked in bitter, ongoing conflict, of ambition and resentment simmering beneath the polished surface of royal protocol. The house belonged to her father, a man who would one day be known to history as King George II of Great Britain. But on the evening of Louisa's birth, he was still merely the Prince of Wales, heir to the throne, not yet its master. And he had been effectively banished from the official court of his own father, King George I, after a falling out so fierce and so public that it had split the royal family into two rival camps, each with its own following, its own social circle, and its own political allegiances. Leicester House had therefore become something of a shadow court, a place where the future king and his circle gathered, where opposition politicians came to scheme and gossip, where artists and intellectuals found patronage, and where the sounds of music and laughter floated through the gilded rooms in deliberate contrast to the more formal and chilly atmosphere of the official court just across the city. It was into this world, lively, complicated, politically charged, but also warm and intellectually vibrant, that little Louisa arrived on the 18th of December, 1724. She was baptized 4 days later, on the 22nd of December, in the same house where she had been born. The ceremony was an intimate but significant affair, and her godparents were chosen with great care, each representing a connection of political or dynastic importance to the family. Among her sponsors was her elder sister, Princess Amelia, who would watch over the baby with the particular protectiveness of an older sibling. Also among the godparents was Princess Louisa Ulrika of Prussia, a name that would appear again decades later in a very different and more difficult context in our story. The third godparent was Frederick, Prince Royal of Prussia, who would one day become the formidable Frederick the Great, though at the time of Louisa's birth, he was still a young man, his destiny not yet written. Now, it is worth pausing here for a moment to understand who this child was and where she sat within the intricate tapestry of her family. Her mother was Caroline of Ansbach, and we will speak of her in much greater detail as our story unfolds, because Caroline was one of the most remarkable women of her age, and her influence on young Louisa was profound even though it was cut tragically short. Caroline was intelligent, cultured, politically astute, fiercely devoted to her children, and possessed of a wit and a warmth that made her one of the most beloved queen consorts in British history. She was a woman who read philosophy for pleasure, who corresponded with the great thinkers of her day, who played a quiet but decisive role in the politics of the court, and who created around herself an atmosphere of intellectual energy and warmth that filled Leicester House with life. Her father, the future George II, was in many ways the opposite of his wife, emotional, quick-tempered, famously loyal to his friends, prone to violent rages when crossed, and deeply devoted to his family even as he struggled to express that devotion in any graceful way. He loved his children in the particular awkward, overbearing way of men who feel deeply but cannot always find the words or the gestures to convey what they feel. He would later come to regard his youngest daughter, Louisa, with a tenderness that was all the more touching for being slightly clumsy. Louisa was the fifth daughter born to her parents, and the youngest child among the children who survived infancy. In total, her mother had been pregnant 11 times, but 4 of those children had not survived. Of the surviving children, there were 8 in all. Frederick, the eldest, and the Prince of Wales, Anne, who would become the Princess Royal, Amelia, Caroline, Mary, William, Duke of Cumberland, and then Louisa at the end of the line. But here is something interesting about Louisa's position within the family. Her siblings were not all raised together. The older children, Frederick, Anne, Amelia, and Caroline, had been born in Hanover, the German ancestral homeland of the family. And when King George I had quarrelled with his son and effectively banished him from court in 1717, he had done something even more cruel. He had insisted on keeping the older grandchildren with him, separating them from their parents. This meant that Louisa's eldest siblings had grown up largely apart from their mother and father, raised in a kind of gilded captivity. Louisa, by contrast, had never known that separation. She had been born after the family had partially patched things up enough to live at Leicester House, and she grew up alongside the younger set of children, her brother William, Duke of Cumberland, and her sister Princess Mary, forming a close, warm little group that spent their days together under the same roof, eating at the same table, sharing lessons and music and laughter, and the particular closeness that comes from being the youngest members of a large and complicated family. Of this younger group, it was Princess Mary who became Louisa's most constant companion and dearest friend. The two sisters were close in age, similar in temperament, and devoted to each other with a warmth that would endure for the rest of their lives. Indeed, it was Mary who, years after Louisa's death, would travel to Denmark to care for Louisa's orphan children, an act of love that speaks more eloquently than any words about the bond between them. But in 1724, all of that lay far ahead. For now, Louisa was simply a new arrival, the youngest child, the last addition to the family, a small warm bundle of possibility in a world just beginning to take shape around her. The nurses who tended her in those early weeks in the firelit rooms of Leicester House could not have imagined what her life would bring. They could not have imagined the cold sea crossing, the foreign palaces, the unfamiliar language she would one day choose to speak, the husband who would frustrate and disappoint her, even as he came to depend on her, or the 4 small children who would cry for her when she was taken from them too soon. They knew only that she was here, and that the house was a little brighter for her arrival. The world into which Louisa was born was one of extraordinary social contrast, political turbulence, and cultural vitality. Georgian England, so named for the succession of King George, who would reign through the 18th and into the 19th century, was a world in the midst of transformation. The old certainties of the Stuart era had been swept away in the upheaval of the previous century, and in their place had come something new and uncertain, and endlessly fascinating. A constitutional monarchy in which the king ruled but Parliament governed, a society in which the aristocracy still held enormous power, but in which the merchant classes were growing wealthy and restless, a culture in which reason and empiricism were beginning to challenge the old authorities of tradition and faith. London itself was a city of remarkable energy and dreadful squalor in almost equal measure. The fashionable streets of Westminster, where Leicester House stood, were a world away from the crowded alleys and disease-ridden rookeries that lay just beyond the city's fashionable boundaries. The wealthy moved through a world of gilded carriages, fine fabrics, elaborate wigs and powdered hair, candle-lit dinner parties, assembly rooms, pleasure gardens, and endless social calls. The poor made do with what they could find. Louisa grew up in the fashionable part of this world, insulated from its harshest realities, but not entirely unaware of them. She was raised in the orbit of a court that, for all its privileges, was also a place of constant political calculation, social performance, and interpersonal tension. When Louisa was 2 years old, something happened that changed the family's circumstances dramatically. On the 11th of June, 1727, her grandfather, King George I, died. He had been travelling to Hanover, as he frequently did, for he had never entirely abandoned his attachment to his German homeland. When he suffered a stroke, he was 67 years old, and he had reigned for 13 years as the first of the Hanoverian kings of Britain. His death meant that Louisa's father was now King George II, and with that transformation in status came a physical transformation as well. The family left Leicester House and moved into St. James's Palace, the official London residence of the British monarch, a rambling red brick complex in the heart of the city that had served as the centre of royal life for nearly 2 centuries. For little Louisa, who was just 2 years old and would have no memory of the move, St. James's Palace would become simply home, the backdrop against which her childhood unfolded, the place whose long corridors and grand reception rooms and private family apartments she would come to know as intimately as any child knows the house she grew up in. Life at St. James's had its own particular rhythms. There were formal occasions, drawing rooms, as they were called, when the king and queen would receive the court in a long and somewhat tedious ceremony of bowing and curtsying and exchanging pleasantries. There were state banquets and diplomatic receptions. There were the constant comings and goings of politicians, ambassadors, foreign princes, artists and intellectuals, all seeking audience with the king and queen. But there was also a private family life that went on behind the scenes, away from the public gaze. The children gathered in their mothers' rooms, where Queen Caroline held informal court, reading, discussing, playing music, receiving the visits of the scholars and philosophers who sought her conversation. The royal nursery was presided over by nurses and governesses, but the Queen was not one of those mothers who delegated entirely. She was involved, affectionate, present in the lives of her children in a way that was not always the custom among royalty. The summers brought a welcome change of scene. The family would decamp to Richmond Lodge, their summer residence situated near the River Thames in Richmond, southwest of London. Here, Away from the formality of the city, life took on a more relaxed character. The children could run and play in the gardens. The air was cleaner, the pace was slower. And Queen Caroline, who loved the outdoors and had strong opinions about garden design, threw herself into the improvement of the grounds with enthusiastic energy. For Louisa, these summers at Richmond Lodge must have been among the happiest times of her childhood. The river nearby, the gardens to roam, the freedom from the stiff ceremonies of court, and the close company of her siblings. These were the ingredients of a happy girlhood, and she seems to have had an instinctive capacity for happiness, a natural lightness of spirit that would later be remarked upon by all who knew her. Her education proceeded in the manner typical of royal princesses of her era. She was taught by governesses and tutors, and her curriculum covered the subjects considered essential for a young woman of her station. French, which was the language of diplomacy and culture across Europe, and which she would need for communication in any royal court on the continent. German, which was the language of her father's family, and of much of Northern European royal society. Some Latin, history, geography, music, dancing, and the arts of needlework and domestic management. Louisa took naturally to music. She learned to play the clavichord with considerable skill, and she had a genuine love of dance that would stay with her throughout her life and become one of the qualities most noted by observers at the Danish court. She also had a talent for languages that served her well, for she moved through the world of Georgian England, in which multiple languages were in daily use, and she would later prove herself capable of learning yet another tongue, Danish, with a dedication that went far beyond mere duty. But perhaps the most important part of Louisa's education was not found in any formal lesson. It was found in the example set by her mother. If we are to understand Louisa, we must first understand her mother, because Caroline of Ansbach was the defining figure of Louisa's early years, the woman whose example shaped her daughter's character in ways both visible and invisible, the North Star by which a young princess learned how to be a queen. Caroline had been born in 1783 in the small German principality of Brandenburg-Ansbach, and her early life had been one of considerable difficulty. She had lost both her parents at a young age and had been raised at the court of the Elector of Brandenburg, a household that placed great emphasis on learning and intellectual life. It was there that Caroline had developed the extraordinary mind for which she would later be celebrated. She had received proposals of marriage from several European princes, including the future Holy Roman Emperor, and had turned them down because accepting would have required her to convert from Lutheranism to Catholicism. A conversion she refused on grounds of genuine conviction. This was not a small thing. In the early 18th century, religion was bound up with politics in ways that made such decisions consequential and risky. Caroline's principled refusal spoke to a strength of character and a clarity of belief that ran through everything she did. When she eventually married the future George II, then Electoral Prince of Hanover, in 1705, she brought to the marriage not only her considerable personal charm, but also her remarkable intellect. She and her husband were deeply different in temperament. He was volatile where she was measured, impulsive where she was deliberate, loud where she was quiet, but they were devoted to each other in their complicated, argumentative way, and Caroline understood her husband better than he understood himself, which gave her a quiet but formidable influence over him. At the British court, Caroline became something extraordinary, a queen consort who was genuinely respected for her mind. She read philosophy, Leibniz, Locke, Clarke, and corresponded with many of the great thinkers of her age. She discussed theology with the Archbishop of Canterbury. She took an interest in science and medicine, and famously had herself and her children inoculated against smallpox at a time when this was considered dangerously radical, an act of rational courage that saved lives and helped bring inoculation into more common practice. She was also politically astute in ways that she rarely advertised. She worked closely with Robert Walpole, the great Prime Minister, providing a moderating influence on the king and helping to smooth over the many crises that her husband's emotional nature might otherwise have generated. When the king was absent, and he frequently travelled to Hanover, Caroline served as regent, governing the country with calm competence. But for our story, what matters most about Caroline is the mother she was to Louisa. Queen Caroline seems to have been genuinely, warmly, enthusiastically devoted to her children. She was involved in their upbringing in ways that were unusual for a woman of her station, and she created around them an atmosphere that was intellectually stimulating, emotionally warm, and full of life. The Queen's apartments were a gathering place for interesting people, artists, scholars, philosophers, clerics, politicians, and the royal children grew up breathing this air, learning by osmosis that the life of the mind was as important as the life of the court. Louisa, as the youngest, received perhaps the most undivided of Caroline's attention in the early years, before the demands of adolescence and politics began to occupy the older children more fully. Contemporary accounts suggest that she was a lively, charming, sociable little girl, naturally gregarious, quick to smile, easy in company, possessed of a warmth that drew people to her. These were traits that her mother noticed and encouraged. The Queen also noticed something else in her youngest daughter, a natural affinity for music and dance that went beyond mere competence. Caroline, who loved the arts and made the court a centre of cultural life, would have recognized and nurtured these talents in Louisa from an early age. The princess who would one day invite opera companies to Copenhagen and fill the Danish court with the sound of music and laughter was in many ways the product of the woman who had made the court at St. James's a place where culture flourished. And then, in 1737, when Louisa was just 12 years old and approaching 13, the light at the centre of her world was suddenly extinguished. Queen Caroline fell ill in November of 1737. She had been suffering from an umbilical hernia, the same condition that would, in a cruel irony, take her youngest daughter's life 14 years later, and an operation was performed, but it could not save her. She lingered for several agonizing days in great pain, refusing to burden those around her with the full extent of her suffering, even as her body failed. She died on the 20th of November, 1737, at the age of 54. The grief at court was profound. The king, that emotionally volatile man who had depended on his wife's steady wisdom for 32 years, was shattered. He is said to have sobbed for hours, to have been inconsolable. He never remarried, and for the rest of his long life he would speak of Caroline with a tenderness and longing that moved even those who found his behavior in other respects difficult. For the children, the loss was devastating in different ways. The older ones were already established in their lives, had formed their identities, had their own households and interests, but Louisa was 12, old enough to fully feel the blow, young enough that a crucial portion of her growing up years would now have to be navigated without her mother's guidance. It was her older sister, Princess Caroline, who stepped into the role of surrogate mother for the younger children, taking particular care of Louisa. Princess Caroline was a woman of considerable intelligence and integrity. She would never marry, choosing instead to remain at her father's court, where she served as an unofficial companion and support to the aging king, and she provided Louisa with a stable and affectionate presence during the years that followed. But it was not the same. It could not be the same. The woman who had been Louisa's model, her guide, her North Star, was gone, and the girl who had been shaped by that extraordinary mother now had to finish shaping herself in the shadow of an absence that would never entirely lift. The years between her mother's death in 1737 and her marriage in 1743 were years of transition for Louisa, years in which the girl became a young woman, in which the princess began to take on the contours of the adult she was becoming, in which the qualities that would make her remarkable as a queen were quietly forming themselves through daily practice and daily living. She was, by all accounts, a girl, and then a young woman, of considerable charm and sociability. Those who knew her at this period describe her as lively, warm, easy in company, genuinely interested in the people she met and the conversations she found herself in. She had none of the stiffness that sometimes afflicted those raised in the formal atmosphere of a royal court. She was natural, unaffected, direct in her manner while never losing the dignity that was appropriate to her station. She loved music passionately, playing the clavichord with real skill and pleasure. She loved dance. The formal court dances of the period were an art form in themselves, requiring months of practice, a developed sense of rhythm and grace, and a natural ease of movement, all of which Louisa possessed. She loved the theatre and attended performances whenever the opportunity arose. She read widely, as her mother had taught her to do, and she had a gift for conversation on a variety of subjects that those who encountered her at this period found striking and delightful. Her favourite companion during these years was, as we have noted, her sister Princess Mary, a woman who was in many ways Louisa's closest friend, as well as her sister. Mary was warm, artistic and spirited, and the two sisters shared a particular kind of understanding that comes only from having grown up together, having shared the same rooms and the same nurses and the same lessons, having navigated the same losses and the same celebrations. When Mary eventually married, she would become the wife of Frederick II, Landgrave of Hesse Castle. The separation would be felt keenly by Louisa, and when Louisa herself was gone, it would be Mary who travelled to Denmark to care for the children she had left behind. But in these years of waiting, the two sisters were still together, still moving through the familiar world of St. James's Palace and Richmond Lodge, still sharing whispered conversations and private jokes, and the particular ease of two people who have known each other from the very beginning. And all the while, the question of marriage hung over the household, as it always did when there were unmarried royal daughters of marriageable age. In the world of 18th century European monarchy, a prince's primary purpose, however brutal this sounds to modern ears, was to be a useful piece on the diplomatic chessboard. She was an asset to be deployed in the service of her family's political interests, her personal preferences, her happiness, her desires. These were considered, if they were considered at all, as secondary to the interests of the state. A good dynastic marriage could secure alliances, cement peace treaties, counterbalance the influence of rival powers. A bad one, or no marriage at all, left a princess stranded, a liability rather than an asset. George II was well aware of this calculus, and he had been considering potential husbands for his daughters for some time. The problem was that suitable Protestant princes of sufficient rank were not infinitely numerous, and the diplomatic landscape of Europe was constantly shifting in ways that made some alliances desirable at one moment and irrelevant the next. For Louisa, the wait stretched into her late teenage years. She had no say in the matter. That was simply the reality of her world. But there is no evidence that she resented this or chafed against it in any dramatic way. She accepted the circumstances of her life with a pragmatic grace that would characterize her conduct in many difficult situations to come. The year 1743 would bring her answer. It would come, as so many answers do, from an unexpected direction, shaped by forces that had nothing to do with Louisa herself, and everything to do with the great swirling game of European power politics. To understand why Louisa found herself on a boat heading to Denmark in the autumn of 1743, we need to understand something about the Europe of her time. A Europe in constant flux, where alliances formed and dissolved, where wars erupted and treaties were signed, where every royal marriage was a diplomatic calculation as much as a personal event. The year 1743 found the major European powers locked in a complicated struggle for dominance. The War of the Austrian Succession had been grinding on for several years, drawing in nearly every significant power on the continent. Britain, under King George II, was involved in the conflict in various ways, both directly and indirectly, and was deeply concerned with securing its northern flank against potential threats. Denmark-Norway, the combined kingdom ruled from Copenhagen, occupied a strategically important position in northern Europe. It controlled access to the Baltic Sea through the waters between the Danish peninsula and the Scandinavian peninsula, waters through which a huge proportion of European trade passed. Whoever had Denmark's friendship had an advantage. Whoever had Denmark as an enemy faced significant difficulties. Both Britain and France recognized this, and in 1743, both powers were actively competing for Danish favor. France had the advantage of being a Catholic power, which might have aligned naturally with certain Danish interests, but Denmark was a Protestant country, a Lutheran kingdom, and this gave Britain a significant edge in the competition for a marriage alliance. A Protestant bride for Denmark's crown prince was something Britain could provide, and France could not. The Danish king at this time was Christian VI, a deeply religious man, a fervent pietist who had made the Danish court one of the most austere and strictly moral royal establishments in Europe. He banned theatrical performances, sharply curtailed public festivities, and surrounded himself with an atmosphere of pious solemnity that made life at court something of an ordeal for those who craved a livelier company. He was not a man who was easy to like or easy to know, but he was sincere in his convictions and genuinely believed that the rigorous moral atmosphere he created was good for his kingdom. Christian had one surviving son, Frederick, the crown prince, and Frederick was, in almost every respect, the opposite of his father. Frederick had grown up under the oppressive weight of his father's strict pietism, and he had responded to it, as young people so often do to excessive rigidity, by swinging as far as possible in the opposite direction the moment he had any freedom to do so. He had developed a taste for pleasure in all its forms: drinking, which he pursued with something approaching dedication; women, with whom he pursued relationships that were neither discreet nor few; and in general, the kinds of revelry that his father found most scandalous. By 1743, Frederick's reputation for debauchery was sufficiently well known that it had become something of a diplomatic problem. His father and his father's ministers were alarmed by his conduct, and there was a general feeling that what the crown prince needed, what might save him, was a good marriage. A sensible, steady wife might provide an anchor, a source of stability, a reason to moderate his behavior. At least, this was the hope. It was also the case that Christian VI had political reasons for wanting a British alliance. He harbored ambitions regarding the Swedish throne. There was a complex succession dispute underway in Sweden, and Christian had ideas about placing his son on the Swedish throne, and British support for such ambitions would be enormously valuable. A marriage alliance between his son and a British princess seemed to offer exactly the combination of political and personal benefits he was looking for. On the British side, the ministers of King George II saw the alliance as useful precisely because it would secure Danish friendship in the ongoing competition with France for influence in Northern Europe. George himself was reportedly less enthusiastic. He felt that Denmark was not the most distinguished match his daughter could have made, but he recognized the political logic and ultimately agreed to the arrangement. And so the negotiations began. They moved with the particular brisk efficiency that characterized diplomatic negotiations of this era, when the principals, the actual people who would be getting married, had little input into the process, and the diplomats on both sides were focused on the practical and political details rather than any concern for the feelings of the individuals involved. The marriage treaty was concluded on the 14th of September, 1743. The terms were agreed, the documents were signed, the arrangement was official. Louisa, 18 years old and days away from her 19th birthday, was to leave England and travel to Denmark, where she would marry Frederick, Crown Prince of that kingdom, a man she had never met. History does not record how she felt about this. She left no diary, no personal letters from this period that might allow us to peer inside her experience. What we know is that she accepted the situation with the grace and composure that the world expected of her, that she made her preparations without visible complaint, and that when the time came to say her goodbyes and begin her journey, she did so with her head held high. She was leaving everything she had ever known. She was going to a country whose language she did not speak, to marry a man she had only seen in a portrait, to build a life in a place she had never visited. She was doing so because she was a princess, and this was what princesses did. She was 18 years old, and the adventure, for that is what we must call it, whatever its difficulties, was about to begin. On the 19th of October, 1743, Princess Louisa of Great Britain left London and began the journey that would change the entire course of her life. The preparations for her departure had been extensive. The Lord Chamberlain, the official responsible for managing the practical arrangements of the royal household, had overseen the provisioning of the royal party with everything the princess would need for a journey that would take several weeks and cross both sea and land. Sets of royal bedding, portmanteaus filled with clothing and personal items, a travelling tea equipage for the all-important business of refreshment along the way, and various other supplies were assembled and loaded for the voyage. Louisa would travel first by sea, aboard a vessel called HMY Fubbs, one of the royal yachts that the British Crown maintained for just such purposes. The Fubbs was a handsome vessel, well suited for the crossing, and Louisa was accompanied by a retinue of English attendants who would keep her company during the voyage and the overland portions of the journey, before being exchanged for Danish attendants at the appropriate point. The sea crossing took her not directly to Denmark, but first to the European continent, to her father's other realm, the Electorate of Hanover, the German territory from which the family had originally come, and which was still ruled by the British Crown in a personal union. This was the destination of the first stage of the journey, and it was here that something of profound significance would take place before Louisa had even set eyes on her future husband, for this was where the Proxy wedding would be conducted. The ceremony took place on the 10th of November, 1743, in the church at the Lion Palace in Hanover. A Proxy wedding was a common practice in royal and aristocratic circles of the period when the principals to a marriage could not be physically present in the same location at the same time. The idea was that the marriage contract could be legally and formally concluded even before the two parties met, with someone standing in for the absent party. In this case, the person who stood in for Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark at the ceremony was Louisa's own brother, William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. William was the second son of King George II and Queen Caroline, a soldier of considerable ability and reputation, who had commanded British forces at the Battle of Dettingen just a few months earlier. He was a family member. He was someone Louisa knew and trusted, and he had been legally authorized to act in Frederick's place by a formal document, written in Latin, as such legal instruments were, that Frederick had sent ahead granting William the necessary authority. So it was that Louisa of Great Britain professed her marriage vows in the church at Lion Palace, facing not the man she was marrying but her own brother, standing in his stead. It was an odd ceremony by any modern reckoning. A wedding without a groom, a promise made to a proxy, a union legally enacted between two people who had never met. Yet this was how things were done, and the ceremony was conducted with full solemnity and in accordance with all the appropriate forms. After the ceremony, the legal marriage having been concluded, Louisa continued her journey eastward toward the border of what was then the Danish Duchy of Holstein, the part of the Danish realm that was located on the European continent rather than on the islands and peninsula of Denmark proper. And it was here, in the border city of Altona, that the moment she had both dreaded and anticipated finally arrived. Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark came to meet her. They met for the first time on the 17th of November, 1743, a week after the Proxy wedding had made them legally man and wife. In real terms, of course, they were strangers. He had seen her portrait. She had presumably seen his. Each had heard reports of the other from the diplomats and courtiers who had been involved in negotiating the marriage. But all of that was very different from standing face to face with another human being and looking into their eyes. Frederick was 20 years old, just 9 months older than Louisa. He was not an unhandsome young man, by the accounts of the time. He had the features of his family, the Oldenburg kings of Denmark, and he carried himself with the careless ease of a young man who had never been required to discipline himself very much. His reputation had preceded him, of course. The drinking, the women, the general atmosphere of licentious abandon that had so troubled his pious father. But reputation is one thing, and presence is another. What Louisa thought of him in that first moment of meeting, we cannot know. She left no record. What we know is that when the two young people finally stood face to face in Altona, they seemed to have found in each other, if not the deep emotional connection of a love match, at least a kind of basic compatibility, a mutual regard, an ability to occupy the same space without hostility. This would prove more important than it might seem. In Altona, the formal exchange of retinues took place. Louisa's English attendants, who had accompanied her from London, now handed her over to her new Danish household, the person appointed as her chief court mistress, the woman who would be her primary companion and guide in her new life, was Christiane Henriette Louise Jewel. Her new chamberlain was Carl Jewel. These were the people who would now be closest to her daily life, and the quality of those relationships would matter enormously for a young woman navigating an unfamiliar world. And then, accompanied by Frederick and her new Danish retinue, Louisa made the final leg of her journey, the approach to Copenhagen, the capital city of her new homeland, the place that would be her home for the rest of her life. The official entry of Crown Princess Louisa into the Danish capital on the 11th of December 1743 was a moment of considerable ceremony and public celebration. Copenhagen was a city of real vitality and character in the mid-18th century. It sat on the northeastern edge of the island of Zealand, facing across the narrow sound called the Öresund toward Sweden. The city had been shaped by the sea. The harbour was its heart, the trade routes its lifeblood, the ships that came and went its connection to the wider world. The skyline was defined by church spires and the towers of royal palaces, and the streets, some grand and wide, others narrow and winding, were full of the particular energy of a trading city at its peak. The Christiansborg Palace, which had been recently completed under King Christian VI, was the principal residence of the Danish monarchy, and the backdrop against which much of our story will unfold. It was a grand structure in the Baroque style, built on the small island of Slotsholmen, literally Castle Island, in the center of the city, connected to the rest of Copenhagen by bridges. The palace was enormous by any measure. Hundreds of rooms, vast reception halls, a chapel, kitchens, stables, and all the apparatus of a major royal establishment. Its scale was intended to project an image of power and permanence, and it succeeded. When Louisa and Frederick made their official entry into Copenhagen on that December day, the streets were lined with cheering crowds who had come to welcome their new crown princess. This first encounter between Louisa and the Danish people was, by all accounts, an immediate success. She was greeted with warmth and enthusiasm, and she responded in kind, smiling, acknowledging the crowds, conducting herself with the natural ease and warmth that was already beginning to emerge as one of her defining characteristics. That same day, the 11th of December, a second and final wedding ceremony was held in the chapel of the newly completed Christiansborg Palace. This was the ceremony with the groom actually present, the ceremony at which the two young people stood side by side and made their vows face to face. It was, in a sense, the real wedding, the moment at which the legal form of the proxy ceremony was confirmed and completed by the physical and emotional reality of the two parties standing together in the presence of God and the assembled court. Just 1 week after the wedding, on the 18th of December, Louisa celebrated her 19th birthday. It was her first birthday in Denmark, her first in her new home. And to mark the occasion, the German poet Johann Elias Schlegel, a poet associated with the Danish court, composed a cantata in her honor. The gesture was small but touching, a recognition that this young woman, who had crossed the sea to come here, deserved to have her birthday marked with something that was warm and celebratory, rather than merely formal. After the wedding celebrations had subsided and the court had returned to something approaching its usual rhythm, the young couple took up residence in Charlottenborg Palace. This was a handsome building in the Baroque style, located on Copenhagen's largest square, Kongens Nytorv, the King's New Square, and it served as the home of the Crown Prince and Princess, while the senior court remained at Christiansborg. It was here that Louisa began the process of learning what her life was going to be. The early months and years of Louisa's life in Denmark were, by any honest reckoning, a period of considerable challenge. She had arrived in a country where everything was unfamiliar. The language was different from anything she had studied. The climate was harsher. Copenhagen's winters were long and cold and dark in a way that the English winters she had grown up with were not. The court culture was different, shaped by the stern, pietist convictions of King Christian VI, in ways that made it one of the most austere and joyless royal establishments in Europe. And the husband to whom she was now bound was a young man of uncertain character and well-established vices. Let us speak first of the court, because it was the sea in which Louisa had to swim, the environment that would shape her daily life in ways both large and small. Christian VI's court was deeply marked by his religious convictions. The king was a fervent pietist, a follower of a movement within Lutheranism that placed enormous emphasis on personal piety, inner devotion, rigorous moral discipline, and a somewhat suspicious attitude toward worldly pleasures. Theatrical performances had been effectively banned from the court. Public festivities were curtailed. The atmosphere was one of serious, somewhat oppressive godliness, a place where frivolity was frowned upon and where the pleasures that Louisa loved most, music, dance, theatre, lively social gatherings, were regarded with deep suspicion. For a young woman who had grown up in the culturally vibrant court of her mother, Queen Caroline, where artists and intellectuals gathered, where theatre was embraced, where conversation and laughter were celebrated, the Danish court of Christian VI must have felt like entering a grey and silent world after years of colour and noise. The contrast would have been striking, and adjusting to it required a degree of patience and self-discipline that speaks well of Louisa's character. she also faced the challenge of her in-laws. King Christian and his queen, Sophie Magdalene, were not unkind people, but they were deeply formal, deeply serious, and deeply committed to the strict moral atmosphere they had created at court. Sophie Magdalene in particular was known for her rigorous piety and her somewhat unbending manner. For a lively, warm, naturally sociable young woman like Louisa, navigating these relationships required considerable tact. And then there was Frederick. Whatever hopes had been entertained that marriage would reform Frederick's dissolute habits, those hopes were not immediately realized. Frederick had grown up in an environment so oppressive in its insistence on moral perfection that his rebellion against it had taken the form of an almost compulsive embrace of its opposite. He drank extensively and chronically. He kept the company of women who were not his wife. He participated in the kind of revelry that his father found most repugnant. There is evidence that he tried, at least in the early years, to moderate himself somewhat in deference to his new wife. The accounts we have suggest that he treated Louisa with genuine respect and even a certain warmth, and that the couple developed what might be called a functional and reasonably affectionate partnership, even if it fell well short of a grand love story. He came to depend on her steadiness, her warmth, her social ease, qualities he lacked and that she possessed in abundance. He was comfortable in her company in a way that he was not comfortable everywhere, but the behavior did not stop. Frederick continued to have affairs and eventually settled into what became an almost acknowledged relationship with a woman named Elsa Hansen, known to history as Madame Hansen, who would be his primary mistress during the years of Louisa's queenship, and who was, in a particularly pointed irony, almost as frequently pregnant as Louise herself. Louisa's response to this situation is one of the aspects of her story that most impresses those who study her life. She did not rage or weep publicly or make scenes. She pretended not to notice. She maintained an unruffled dignity in public that gave no indication of whatever private pain she may have felt. She directed her considerable emotional and creative energy into the things she could control: her friendships, her love of music and theatre, her relationships with the people around her, and eventually her deep devotion to her children. Contemporary observers at the Danish court were struck by her composure and her naturalness. The Danish writer Charlotte Dorothea Beale, who had access to the court and wrote about its life, described a world in which the crown princess was a warm and genuinely engaging presence, someone who made people feel welcomed, who could converse on many subjects, who brought a lightness to the atmosphere of the court that had been missing before her arrival. And there was one thing that Louisa did, from the very beginning of her time in Denmark, that would prove more important for her long-term reputation than almost anything else she did. She began to learn Danish. This was not a small thing. The Danish royal court, in the mid-18th century, conducted itself largely in German. German was the language of educated society across Northern Europe, the language of diplomacy and culture and court ceremony. The Danish royal family itself was of German origin. The Oldenburg dynasty had been a German ruling house before it had become the ruling house of Denmark, and German remained the language of the inner circle, the language in which serious business was conducted. For a new crown princess to bother learning Danish, to study the language of the common people, of the merchants and farmers and fishermen who made up the vast majority of the kingdom's population, was genuinely unusual. No one required it of her. No one expected it. It would have been perfectly acceptable, by the standards of the time, for Louisa to continue speaking French and German and leave the Danish language to those who had grown up with it. But Louisa chose differently, and in making that choice, she did something that went straight to the hearts of the Danish people. She learned Danish, not merely a few polite phrases, not the minimum necessary to conduct a ceremonial exchange, but genuinely learned to speak the language, to read it, to use it in conversation. And she made it a priority that her children, when they came, would be raised speaking Danish, in a court where German was the default, where even the king barely spoke the language of his own people. This was a remarkable and deeply deliberate act of identification with her adopted country. The Dano-Norwegian writer Ludvig Holberg, one of the great literary figures of his age, wrote about this with evident admiration, noting that it was impossible to describe with what sincere pleasure the common people heard their queen speak to them in their own language. In those words, we can hear the echo of what Louisa's language learning meant to ordinary Danes. It was a signal that she saw them, that she was one of them, that she had chosen Denmark not merely as a political destination, but as her home and her people. Let us pause in our narrative and spend a little time inside the daily world of Charlottenborg Palace, where Louisa and Frederick lived in the years between the wedding of 1743 and the accession of 1746, because it is in the texture of daily life that character is most truly revealed, and because the life she built in those years was, in many ways, the foundation on which the later, more public life of the Queen was constructed. Charlottenborg was, by the standards of Danish royal residences, a relatively modest establishment, though by any ordinary reckoning it was a large and handsome building. It sat on Kongens Nytorv, the great square at the heart of Copenhagen, surrounded by the life of the city in a way that the more isolated Christiansborg was not. From its windows, one could see the bustle of the square below, the carriages and the pedestrians, the merchants and the soldiers, and the ordinary citizens going about their business. The city was always present, always audible, always there. For Louisa, who had grown up in the heart of London, and who had a natural affinity for urban life and human company, this proximity to the city must have been congenial. She was not a person who was happiest in formal ceremonial settings. She was happiest in rooms where things were happening, where conversation was flowing, where music was playing, where people were present and engaged. Charlottenborg, for all its limitations, provided this kind of setting more readily than the grander but more isolated Christiansborg would have done. The daily routine of the crown princess would have followed the patterns established by court protocol. Morning prayers, the formal levee at which courtiers were received, meals taken with appropriate ceremony, the afternoon hours that might be given to music or reading or correspondence, or the informal social gatherings that Louisa enjoyed so much. In the evenings, there might be card parties, or small musical performances, or theatrical entertainments arranged for the household. Louisa threw herself into the business of learning Danish with real dedication. She worked with teachers and tutors, practiced in her conversations with the Danish members of her household, and applied herself to the task with the same natural intelligence and diligence that she had brought to her other studies in England. By the accounts of those who observed her progress, she made it with impressive speed, not achieving, perhaps, the fluency of a native speaker, but arriving very quickly at a level of competence that allowed her to communicate genuinely and meaningfully in the language of her adopted country. She was also building relationships, the network of friendships and alliances that was essential to anyone navigating the complex social world of a royal court. The women who served as her ladies-in-waiting were her constant companions, and she cultivated real warmth with those among them who were congenial to her. The Danish nobles and officials who had dealings with the crown princess found her genuinely engaging, not merely pleasant in the way that courtesy demanded, but actually interested, actually attentive, actually present in the encounter. There were also the relationships with the wider cultural world of Copenhagen. the artists and musicians and writers who moved at the periphery of the court, seeking patronage and offering their gifts. Louisa was drawn naturally to these people. She had grown up in a household where intellectual and creative life was valued, where interesting people were welcomed and their contributions recognized. She brought the same instincts to her life in Denmark. And then there was the management of the household itself, the domestic side of the crown princess's role that is rarely discussed in historical accounts. But that was, in practical terms, one of the most important dimensions of her daily work. A royal household was a complex organization. Dozens of servants, elaborate systems of protocol and precedence, large amounts of money to be managed, relationships between different parts of the establishment to be navigated. Louisa seems to have brought to this work the same intelligent practicality that she brought to everything else. Through all of this activity, the language learning, the social cultivation, the cultural engagement, the household management, ran the thread of her husband's behavior, which remained something she had to live around rather than with. Frederick was, during these years, a young man of considerable energy and very little discipline. He drank with a frequency and a dedication that were already, even at 20, beginning to affect his health and his judgment. He pursued his pleasures with an openness that left his household in no doubt about his priorities, and he was, by the accounts of those who knew him in this period, genuinely careless of the hurt he caused, not maliciously so, but in the way of someone who has never had to consider the feelings of others, because the world has always arranged itself around his comfort. Louisa's response, the dignified silence, the composed acceptance, the refusal to let her husband's failures diminish her own conduct, was something that took practice. It was not natural to any feeling person to watch a spouse conduct himself in ways that were humiliating and hurtful without reacting. The composure that she maintained year after year in the face of this provocation speaks to a quality of self-discipline and self-possession that was truly remarkable. We know from various accounts that there was, at least in the early years of the marriage, genuine warmth between the two of them, that Frederick was capable of treating his wife with real kindness and consideration when he was at his best, and that there were moments of real companionship and even affection. The painting by Wilhelm Marstrand, a 19th century historical canvas that depicts the crown prince and princess sharing cherries in their apartment at Charlottenburg, was based on a scene described by Charlotte Dorothea Beale, who had access to the court. It captures, or tries to capture, something of the domestic intimacy that was possible between them in their better moments. These better moments were real, and they matter, because they remind us that Louisa's marriage was not simply a story of endurance. It was also, at its best, a story of two young people finding their way toward each other across the considerable distance that their different temperaments and different values created. He depended on her more than he knew. She cared for him, probably, more than was strictly wise. And through all of it, she was learning the language, learning the country, learning the court, learning herself. By the time her father-in-law died and she found herself suddenly a queen at 21, she was not the uncertain young woman who had stepped off the boat in Altona. She was someone who had spent 3 years building a life, establishing relationships, developing her understanding of the world she was now called to help lead. She was, in short, ready. The year 1745 brought Louisa her first experience of motherhood, and with it, her first experience of the particular grief that came with losing a child. Her first pregnancy had proceeded in the ordinary way, attended by the usual mix of anticipation and anxiety that surrounded all royal pregnancies of the period. The birth of a child, and particularly of a male heir, was a matter of dynastic importance as well as personal significance, and the whole court followed the progress of the crown princess's condition with considerable interest. On the 7th of July, 1745, Louisa gave birth to a son, The child was born at Christiansborg Palace, where the crown princess had come for the birth, and he was christened with the name Christian, a name that followed the Danish royal tradition of alternating between the names Christian and Frederick for male heirs, according to the name of the father. For Frederick's son, Christian was the appropriate choice. The birth was a moment of joy, not only for the parents, but for the whole court and the Danish people, who welcomed the arrival of an heir as a sign of stability and continuity for the dynasty. Louisa, by all accounts, was a devoted mother from the very beginning, engaged and affectionate in her approach to her children, in a way that was not universal among royalty of the period. But the joy was not to last. The little Prince Christian, born in the heat of a Copenhagen summer, did not thrive. He struggled with his health from an early age, and despite all the care that could be provided for a royal child in the mid-18th century, he grew weaker rather than stronger as the months passed. He was moved to Frederiksborg Palace, the beautiful castle north of Copenhagen, in the hope that the cleaner air and different environment might help. It did not. On the 3rd of June, 1747, less than 2 years after his birth, little Prince Christian died at Frederiksborg Palace. He was not quite 2 years old. The loss of a child is always devastating, and no amount of historical distance makes it easier to contemplate. Louisa had loved this little boy, her first child, her first son, the first life she had brought into the world, and his death left a mark on her that, even if she did not display it publicly, must have been real and deep. But by the time little Christian died, much else had changed in the world around Louisa, because on the 6th of August, 1746, nearly a year before the little prince's death, something of enormous significance had happened. King Christian VI had died. He had been in poor health for some time, and when he passed away at Hirschholm Palace on the 6th of August, 1746, at the age of 46, his death brought with it a transformation that would reshape Louisa's world entirely. Frederick became King Frederick V of Denmark and Norway, and Louisa, at the age of 21, became Queen of Denmark and Norway. Between the death of little Christian VI and the death of little Prince Christian, between August of 1746 and June of 1747, much had happened. In July of 1746, just weeks after her father-in-law's death, Louisa had given birth to a daughter, whom she named Sophia Magdalena, after the grandmother on the Danish side, and in July of 1747, just weeks after little Prince Christian's death, she gave birth to another daughter, Wilhelmina Caroline. Children were coming with remarkable speed, in the way that was common for royal women of the period, for whom pregnancy and childbirth were virtually a permanent condition of married life. And with each child, Louisa's love of motherhood deepened, her commitment to raising her children with her own hands and in the Danish language became more fierce, and her determination to give them the kind of warm, engaged mothering she had herself experienced, however briefly, from her own mother grew stronger. But before we follow Louisa into the years of her queenship, let us pause to appreciate what it meant that her father-in-law was gone, because his death did not merely change her title. It changed everything about the world she lived in. The death of Christian VI and the accession of Frederick V to the throne of Denmark and Norway was, in cultural terms, something like the opening of a window that had been shut for years. The cold, oppressive air of the old court, with its bans on theatre, its distrust of pleasure, its heavy emphasis on pious solemnity, was suddenly, refreshingly, swept away. The new king and queen had very different ideas about what a court should be. Almost immediately, the transformation began, and those who were present at the Danish court in those early months of the new reign described the change with a sense of relief and delight that makes plain how claustrophobic the atmosphere under Christian VI had been. One of the most striking and symbolic changes was the removal of the heavy iron chains that had previously surrounded Christiansborg Palace. These chains had been placed there to keep the common people at a distance, to maintain a physical separation between the royal presence and the ordinary world. Their removal was not a merely practical decision. It was a statement. It said, "We are open. You are welcome." The distance between the crown and the people is not as great as it was. Into Christiansborg's great halls came music. Into its salons came laughter. The balls that had been conspicuously absent from the social calendar of the stern old king were now regular features of court life. The theatrical performances that had been effectively banned were welcomed back. The Italian opera, that was among the most fashionable entertainments in the capitals of Europe, was brought to Copenhagen. We will speak of this in more detail shortly. And the court, that had been so grey and silent, began to ring with the sounds of strings and voices and the rhythmic pleasure of dance. Much of this transformation is attributed, by contemporaries and by historians since, to Queen Louisa. Her influence on the character of the new court was profound. She had grown up in the orbit of her mother's court, which had been one of the most culturally vibrant in Europe. She knew what a court could be. She had the natural social gifts, the warmth, the ease, the genuine interest in people and in cultural life, to make the vision a reality. And she had, crucially, the freedom to act now that the austere reign of her father-in-law was over. Frederick's accession also brought changes in the physical environment. The royal couple moved from the prince's mansion, where they had been living since 1745, across the Frederiksholms Canal, into the great Christiansborg Palace itself, which now became their primary residence as king and queen. The ceremonies of accession were concluded when Frederick and Louisa were solemnly anointed in the chapel of Frederiksborg Palace on the 4th of September, 1747. A solemn and beautiful ceremony that marked the formal beginning of their reign. Let us speak of Louisa's cultural contributions in more detail, because they deserve to be understood clearly. In 1747, the same year as her coronation, Louisa invited to Copenhagen the opera company of Pietro Mingotti, a Venetian impresario who led one of the finest opera troupes in Europe. Mingotti had built his company by assembling exceptional talent from across the continent, and the company that came to Copenhagen at the Queen's invitation included two names that would become significant in the history of music: Christoph Willibald Gluck, who would go on to revolutionize opera with his radical reforming vision, and Giuseppe Sarti, a composer of considerable gifts who would have a distinguished career in his own right. The presence of this company at the Danish court was a statement about the kind of court it was going to be: an international court, a cultured court, a court that looked outward rather than inward, that embraced the best of European cultural life rather than fearing it. The following year, 1748, brought another cultural landmark: the opening of Den Danske Skueplads, the Danish theatre, in a new building. The establishment of a proper national theatre in Copenhagen was part of the broader cultural flowering that marked the reign of Frederick V, and the Queen's enthusiasm for theatrical performance was one of the factors that created the atmosphere in which such an institution could flourish. But it was not only through her patronage of the arts that Louisa won the love of the Danish people. It was through something simpler and more immediate than that. A Swedish diplomat who was stationed in Copenhagen during Louisa's years as queen left us one of the most vivid contemporary portraits of her. He wrote, "She has good sense and is easy with words, friendly in tone, knows how to converse on many subjects, and can speak several languages. While giving court, she seldom leaves anyone without saying something nice. She very much enjoys dance and dances well. She has a good temper and is known for her piety and excellent qualities. She finds pleasure in reading and music. She plays the clavichord well and teaches her daughters to sing. In those words, we can see the woman herself, not the queen as a political entity, not the consort as a symbol, but the actual human being, warmly present in a room, finding a kind word for each person who came before her, dancing with genuine pleasure, reading, making music, teaching her children. And then there was the language. Again and again, in the records left by those who observed her, the point is made about how much the Danish people appreciated her effort to speak their language. Ludwig Holberg expressed it memorably. It was impossible, he wrote, to describe with what sincere pleasure a common man hears Her Majesty speak Danish with the royal children. The Queen was not merely speaking Danish herself, she was raising her children in Danish. In a court where German was the language of power, she was deliberately choosing the language of the people for her family. This was remarkable. It was also deeply strategic, whether or not Louisa calculated it as such, and one suspects that she was natural and genuine enough in her approach to language and culture that it was simply what felt right to her, rather than a calculated political move. She had chosen Denmark as her country. She wanted to be Danish. She wanted her children to be Danish, and she communicated this through the most fundamental and personal of channels, the language in which she spoke to them. The years from 1746 to 1750 were, in many ways, the years of Louisa's greatest flourishing as a queen. She was young. She was at the height of her considerable social gifts. She was presiding over a court that was alive with cultural energy and social warmth, and she was producing children, the evidence of her centrality to the dynasty's future, with remarkable regularity. Let us follow her through these years, noting the particular rhythms and textures of her life as queen. The palaces that formed the backdrop of her daily existence were among the finest in Northern Europe. Christiansborg, in central Copenhagen, was the primary residence, the grand official home, where the ceremonies of state took place, where ambassadors were received, where the great balls and theatrical performances were held. But there were other residences as well, each with its own character and its own associations. Fredensborg Palace, whose very name, which means Peace Castle, suggests its character, was a favourite summer residence, a more intimate and beautiful building than the Grand Christiansborg, set amid gardens and forests north of Copenhagen near a lake. Louisa loved it here, and the summers spent at Fredensborg had a particular warmth and ease about them that the more formal winters in Copenhagen did not always match. Frederiksborg Palace, set on a hill to the west of the city, with views across the gardens and the surrounding landscape, was another retreat, a place where the court could find something approaching quiet. And Rosenborg Castle, older and more intimate than Christiansborg, the summer residence of earlier kings, now containing the royal collection of treasures including the crown jewels, was a place of particular beauty and historical resonance, a place where Denmark's royal past was palpably present. Through all of these palaces and gardens, Louisa moved with the ease of a woman who had made herself genuinely at home in her adopted country. She had arrived as a stranger. She had become a Dane. Not entirely, not in every way. There would always be something English about her, some residue of the world she had grown up in, but substantially, meaningfully, in the ways that mattered most. Meanwhile, children continued to arrive. We have already met Sophia Magdalena, born in July of 1746, and Wilhelmina Caroline, born in July of 1747. In January of 1749, a son was born, the future King Christian VII, and in January of 1750, a daughter, also named Louise, completed the family of children who would survive their mother. Each birth was celebrated with the ceremony appropriate to a royal event. When Christian, the future king, was born on the 29th of January 1749, Christoph Willibald Gluck, who was at that time the conductor of the Royal Opera troupe, composed a celebratory work, an opera called La Contessa dei Numi, the Contention of the Gods, in which the Olympian gods gathered at the banks of the Great Belt to discuss who should be the special protector of the new prince. It was an elaborate and charming gesture, and it speaks to the cultural richness of the court that Louisa had helped to create. Louisa was also, by all accounts, a mother of the most engaged and devoted kind. In an era when royal children were routinely handed over to nurses and governesses and raised largely at arm's length from their parents, Louisa insisted on a more personal approach. She taught her daughters to sing. The Swedish diplomat noted this specifically. She spent time with her children in ways that went beyond the formal visits that protocol demanded. She created for them, within the walls of the palace, something approaching the warm family life that she had herself experienced in the happier years of her own childhood. And all the while, Frederick was, being Frederick. His affairs continued, discreetly or indiscreetly, depending on the year. His mistress, Madame Hansen, occupied a position at court that everyone knew about and no one quite acknowledged. She was, as noted, almost as frequently pregnant as the Queen, bearing Frederick 5 illegitimate children between 1746 and 1751. Louisa's response to this situation remained what it had always been: dignified, composed, and entirely private. If she suffered, she did not show it. If she was angry, she did not express it. She maintained the graceful pretense that everything was as it should be, and in doing so preserved both her dignity and the outward harmony of the court. This was not weakness. It was a particular kind of strength, the strength to endure a painful reality with grace, to choose the larger good over the private satisfaction of complaint or confrontation, to refuse to let another's failures diminish one's own conduct. In an era when a queen consort had very little power and very few options for addressing a husband's infidelity, Louisa's chosen response was probably the wisest and most dignified available to her, and she was loved for it, loved by the court, loved by the people, loved in a way that her husband, despite his kingship, was not quite loved. The popularity of the royal couple, contemporary accounts are clear on this point, was largely to be attributed to Louisa. She was the one who had won Danish hearts. She was the one whose presence made the court something that people wanted to be part of. To understand the context of Louisa's reign more fully, let us take a moment to look beyond the walls of Christiansborg and Charlottenborg and Fredensborg, to look at the Denmark and the Europe of which she was a part. The Denmark of the 1740s and 1750s was a country with a distinctive character and a complicated geopolitical position. The kingdom ruled from Copenhagen was, in fact, a dual monarchy. Denmark and Norway were governed together under the same king, connected by the sea routes that linked the Danish islands and peninsula with the mountainous Norwegian coast. It was a Protestant kingdom, Lutheran in its faith, in a Europe still largely divided between Protestant and Catholic. It was a trading nation, dependent on the great maritime routes that passed through its waters, with a commercial class that was growing in wealth and confidence. Copenhagen itself was a city of roughly 100,000 inhabitants, a significant European capital by the standards of the time, though smaller than London or Paris or Vienna. It was a cosmopolitan city in the maritime sense. Ships came from all over the world, and with them came sailors and merchants and goods and ideas from places as distant as the East Indies and the Americas. The harbour was the city's beating heart, and the smell of salt water and tar and the sounds of rigging in the wind were constant features of urban life. The cultural life of the city was, thanks in large part to Louisa's influence, flourishing in these years. The Danish theatre she had helped to support brought both Danish works and international productions to Copenhagen audiences. The opera company brought Italian musical drama to a city that proved ready and eager for it. The court balls and social gatherings created a social scene that was lively and international. The scholars and intellectuals who gathered around the university contributed to an intellectual life that was engaged with the great questions of the age. The age itself was one of extraordinary intellectual ferment. The Enlightenment, that great movement of rational inquiry and humanist thought that was reshaping European civilization in the 18th century, was at its height. The ideas of Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau were circulating through the educated classes of Europe, challenging old certainties, proposing new visions of human dignity and rational governance, creating the intellectual climate that would eventually produce revolutions in America and France. Denmark was not immune to these currents. Frederick V's court had a moderate, enlightened character that was in some contrast to the oppressive religiosity of Christian VI, and the seeds being planted in these years would bear fruit in complicated and sometimes violent ways in the decades after Louisa's death. Meanwhile, the European diplomatic landscape continued to shift. The great powers, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, were maneuvering constantly for advantage. The War of the Austrian Succession, which had been underway when Louisa made her journey to Denmark, had concluded with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, only to give way to the complex realignments that would eventually produce the 7 Years' War. Denmark tried, as best it could, to navigate these turbulent waters without being swept into conflicts that could drain its resources and endanger its independence. In this world, Louisa's role was in many ways that of a cultural and social ambassador. She was the face of the Danish monarchy that the international community encountered at court functions and diplomatic gatherings. She was the woman who ensured that Copenhagen's court had a reputation worth having, as a place of culture and warmth and good company, rather than as the gloomy, austere establishment it had been under her father-in-law. She was also a mother who was deeply concerned with the futures of her children in this complex world. She thought about their educations, their characters, their prospects. She worried about the marriages that would be arranged for them, knowing from her own experience what it meant to be married off for political purposes to someone you had never met. And when, in 1751, the question of her daughter Sophia Magdalena's future came to a head, Louisa found herself confronted with a situation that distressed her more deeply than almost anything she had yet faced. The year 1751 was to be the last full year of Louisa's life, though she did not know this when it began. It was a year that brought with it not only the physical deterioration that would eventually kill her, but also a political confrontation that caused her genuine anguish, a confrontation over the future of her eldest surviving daughter. Sophia Magdalena was 4 years old, 5 by the middle of the year, when the Danish government began negotiations with Sweden regarding a proposed marriage alliance. The heir apparent to the Swedish throne was the Crown Prince Gustav, the man who would eventually become King Gustav III of Sweden, one of the most remarkable monarchs of his age. The Danish government, for reasons of state, saw a marriage between Sophia Magdalena and Gustav as a potentially valuable alliance. Louisa opposed it with every means at her disposal. Her opposition rested on several grounds, but the most important was her profound concern for her daughter's welfare. The Swedish court was dominated, everyone knew, by Queen Louisa Ulrika, a woman of strong character, fierce anti-Danish sentiments, and considerable political cunning, who was, in practical terms, the real power at the Swedish court. Queen Louisa Ulrika was opposed to the match, publicly and conspicuously so. She was known for her dislike of Denmark and the Danish, a Danish princess who entered the Swedish royal family under the sponsorship of this woman's court, would be walking into a profoundly hostile environment, and Sophia Magdalena was 5 years old, a child, a small, vulnerable child, who would be sent, as Louisa herself had been sent, though at 18 rather than 5, to a foreign court and a foreign life. There was also, we are told, a more personal dimension to Louisa's resistance. She had experienced her own arranged marriage from the inside, had lived with the complicated reality of being bound to a man she had not chosen, and she disliked the institution instinctively. The knowledge that her daughter was to be subjected to the same process, and at such a tender age and in such unfavourable circumstances, was for Louisa genuinely painful. But her opposition was in vain. The machinery of dynastic politics ground forward regardless of her mother's misgivings, and the match was arranged over Louisa's protests. The marriage between Sophia Magdalena and the Swedish crown prince would eventually take place in 1766, 15 years after Louisa's death, and in very different circumstances than those originally anticipated. But the knowledge that her daughter was to be sent to a court where she had reason to fear the child would not be well treated was one of the shadows that fell over Louisa's final year. And there was another shadow, a darker one and a more immediately present one. Louisa's health was failing. The precise nature of her illness is not fully documented in the historical record, but what we know is this. In the autumn of 1751, while she was pregnant with her sixth child, Louisa developed a pinched umbilical hernia. This was, as we have already noted, the same condition that had killed her mother 14 years earlier. A terrible echo, a painful irony, a repetition that speaks to the hereditary or at least coincidental nature of certain physical vulnerabilities. In an era before modern surgical techniques, before anesthesia in any effective form, before the understanding of infection and antisepsis that would eventually transform medicine, a hernia of this kind was a serious and potentially fatal condition. The court physician and court surgeon were summoned. The situation was assessed. It was determined that an operation was necessary, that there was no other option, and so the court surgeon undertook the procedure, working under conditions that we would today find unimaginably difficult, with instruments that were limited by the knowledge and technology of the age. The operation did not succeed. The surgeon could not save her, and the unborn child she was carrying, her sixth, who had not yet breathed the air of the world, was also lost. December 18th, 1751, was Louisa's 27th birthday. She was by that date gravely ill. The operation had failed. Her condition was deteriorating, and those around her could see what was coming, even if they could not prevent it. Yet the birthday was marked, because birthdays must be marked, because the rituals of celebration provide a structure and a dignity to life even when that life is ebbing away. We do not know who came to see her on that day. We do not know what was said, or how the gathering felt, or whether there was any music. She, who had loved music so much, we do not know whether her children were brought to her, though one imagines that they were, that their small warm presences were welcomed in whatever time remained. We know only that the day passed, as days do, and that she entered her 28th year. She did not reach its end. On the 19th of December, 1751, the day after her 27th birthday, Queen Louisa of Denmark and Norway died at Christiansborg Palace in Copenhagen. She had been queen for 5 years. She had been in Denmark for 8 years. She had been a wife, a mother, a patron of the arts, a student of language, a diplomat of the heart, a woman who had transformed the court she had come to and won the people she had been sent to rule beside. She had done all of this in 27 years, which is less time than most people have to find their footing in the world. The news of her death spread through Copenhagen with the swiftness that news of a significant event always travels in a city, from mouth to mouth, from house to house, from the streets around the palace to the harbour and the market and the university. And wherever the news went, it was received with something that contemporaries describe as genuine, profound grief. The Danish people had loved their queen. They had loved her for her warmth, her ease, her willingness to speak their language, her insistence on raising her children as Danes. They had loved her for the music and the theatre and the balls she had brought to the court, for the way the palace doors had opened when she arrived. They had loved her, most of all, perhaps, for being real, for being present in a way that royalty was not always present, for seeming to see them as individuals rather than as subjects, for treating each person who came before her as someone worth a kind word and a moment of genuine attention. Now she was gone, and they mourned her as they would have mourned someone they knew personally, with a genuine, heartfelt sorrow that had nothing to do with political calculation or diplomatic obligation. After her death, Queen Louise was prepared for the lying in state, the formal, ceremonial period during which a dead monarch or royal consort was displayed in state for the court and the public to pay their respects. This took place in the chapel of Christiansborg Palace, the same chapel where she had been married 8 years before, the same chapel where her children had been baptized, where the great ceremonies of the court's religious life had been observed. It was a space she had known well, a space freighted with memory and meaning. The lying in state was conducted, as the phrase suggests, with great pomp, with the full panoply of royal ceremony, the black-draped rooms, the guards of honor, the candlelight. The court came to pay its respects. The ambassadors of foreign powers came, representing their distant sovereigns and the diplomatic obligations of the age. And the people came, in the way that ordinary people always come at such moments, drawn by grief and curiosity and the simple human need to bear witness. Frederick, her husband, the king, was, by all accounts, devastated. Whatever his failures as a spouse, whatever the distance that his infidelities and his drinking had introduced between them, he had depended on Louisa in ways that he perhaps had not fully understood until she was gone. She had been the social and cultural centre of the court. She had been the person who made his public life function with grace. She had been the mother of his children, the woman whose warmth and dignity had given their life together a coherence it might otherwise have lacked. Her loss left a gap that he did not know how to fill. After lying in state, Louisa's body was prepared for the journey to Roskilde, the town roughly 40 kilometers southwest of Copenhagen that had served as the burial place of the Danish royal family since the 15th century. The cathedral there, built of brick in the Gothic style, was one of the oldest and most beautiful churches in Scandinavia, and it had received the remains of Danish kings and queens for 3 centuries. Within its chapels, surrounded by the elaborate tombs and sarcophagi of her predecessors, Louise would find her final resting place. The funeral procession made its way from Copenhagen to Roskilde, a solemn and stately journey, attended by the rituals of royal mourning, moving through a landscape that was cold and grey in the December chill. The interment took place at Roskilde Cathedral, in a chapel that would later become known as the Frederick V Chapel, for it would eventually receive his remains as well, though he would not join her there for another 14 years. Her sarcophagus was designed by an English sculptor named Carl Frederick Stanley, a choice that seems to reach back across the water toward her English origins even as her body rested permanently in Danish soil. The tomb is a grand white marble structure, in keeping with the neoclassical style of the chapel, and it stands as a lasting testament to the woman who had come so far and done so much in the short years she was given. The weeks and months that followed Louisa's death were marked, at least publicly, by the rituals of royal mourning. But beneath the surface of these rituals, the grief was real, and it manifested itself in ways that reveal much about what Louisa had meant to those who had known her. Frederick, the king, was reportedly inconsolable in the immediate aftermath. He had not been, by any objective measure, a good husband. His drinking and his affairs had made that plain. But he had been, in his way, dependent on Louisa, and her loss confronted him with an emptiness that his usual remedies, drink, pleasure, the distraction of a new liaison, could not easily fill. The Danish people mourned with a sincerity that surprised even those who had observed Louisa's popularity during her lifetime. Contemporary accounts describe a city genuinely cast into grief, a court that had lost not just its queen, but its social heart, a country that felt the absence of someone who had been a real presence in its life. The German poet Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock, who was living in Copenhagen at the time, and who had been one of the great admirers of Queen Louise, expressed the feelings of many in an ode he composed shortly after her death, a poem he addressed to the king and called initially An den König, which would later become known as Die Königin Louisa, the Queen Louise. The poem was an outpouring of genuine feeling, a tribute to a woman who had been loved, and it captured something of the particular grief of those who had known her, the sense that a light had gone out, that something warm and vital had been removed from the world, that things would not be quite the same without her. And Klopstock's poem introduced something else, something that would prove to be an important part of Louisa's posthumous legacy. By writing about her with such feeling, by articulating so clearly what she had meant to those around her, he helped to create an idealized image of the dead queen that would persist long after her death, and against which her successors would inevitably be measured. The comparison was not flattering to those who came after. On the 8th of July, 1752, just 7 months and 19 days after Louisa's death, King Frederick V of Denmark married again. The speed of the remarriage shocked many people, and it is worth pausing to understand why it happened and what it meant. The pressure to remarry came primarily from Count Adam Gottlob von Moltke, who had been Frederick's trusted advisor since childhood and who had enormous influence over the king. Moltke was a man of considerable political intelligence, and he recognized that the situation in Denmark was not stable. The king was a chronic alcoholic whose behavior, unchecked by a steadying presence at his side, was likely to deteriorate further. The court needed a queen. The dynasty needed stability. The king needed someone to fill the role that Louisa had filled. Moltke engineered a match with Duchess Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a young woman of 23 who was the daughter of Ferdinand Albert II, Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, and a sister-in-law of Frederick the Great of Prussia. She was considered a suitable candidate, young, royal, Protestant, and from a family of good reputation. But the people of Denmark were not pleased. 7 months was not long enough. In the popular imagination, the memory of Louisa was still intensely present, still warm and vivid and precious. For the king to remarry before a year had passed, to replace so quickly a queen who had been genuinely loved, felt like a betrayal. The public mood toward the new marriage was cold, and toward Juliana Maria, the new queen, it was even colder. Juliana Maria brought with her the manner and customs of a German princely court, formal, correct, somewhat stiff in the way that contrasted sharply with the natural warmth and ease that had characterized Louisa. She was not a bad woman by any historical reckoning. She would prove herself capable and even, in certain limited respects, politically astute in the years after Frederick's death. But she was not Louisa, and the people of Denmark were not inclined to forget the difference. The contrast between the beloved first queen and the less beloved second was one that would be drawn again and again in the years that followed, not only by ordinary Danes, but by the writers and intellectuals who engaged with the history of the reign. Klopstock's poem had established the terms of comparison, and against the golden ideal of Louisa, Juliana Maria would always come up short. There would be a third queen associated with the Danish court in this period as well, and she too would be measured against Louisa's memory and found wanting, though for very different reasons. This was Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, the niece of Louise, the daughter of Louise's brother Frederick, Prince of Wales, who had died in the same year as Louisa, who came to Denmark in 1766 to marry Louisa's son, King Christian VII. Caroline Matilda's story is one of the most dramatic and tragic in Danish history, involving as it does a mentally ill king, a powerful and controversial court physician, a scandalous affair, a political coup, a trial, and an exile that ended in early death. It is not our story tonight, but it is inextricably bound up with Louisa's, because it was Louisa's failure to live long enough to raise her son that contributed to the conditions that made Christian VII's tragedy possible. Perhaps the most enduring dimension of Louisa's legacy was the one she could not control. What happened to the children she left behind? When she died in December of 1751, her children were the following ages. Sophia Magdalena was 5 years old. Wilhelmina Caroline was 4. Christian, the future king, was 2 years and 10 months, and little Louise was just 11 months old. These 4 small people, bereft of their mother before any of them was old enough to form lasting memories of her, would carry the consequences of her loss with them throughout their lives. The oldest 3, Sophia Magdalena, Wilhelmina Caroline and Christian, had at least had some years in their mother's presence. They had known her voice, her touch, the warmth that she had brought to their daily care. Little Louise, born in January of 1750, had had barely a year with her mother before she lost her. She would grow up knowing Louisa only through the memories of others, through the portraits that hung in the palace, through the stories told by those who had known her. After their mother's death, the children were raised at the Danish court under the supervision of their father and his new queen, Juliana Maria. The relationship between the children of the first marriage and their stepmother was not a warm one. Juliana Maria, as we have noted, gave her primary attention and affection to her own son, Prince Frederick, born in 1753, and the children of Louisa's marriage were left somewhat adrift in the emotional landscape of the court. Christian, in particular, suffered from the consequences of maternal absence and paternal neglect. Frederick, as his drinking worsened, grew increasingly indifferent to the shy, sensitive boy who was the heir to his throne. Christian was not given the emotional foundation that children need, and as he grew older, the deficiencies of his upbringing became increasingly apparent. He developed what we would today recognize as significant mental illness, characterized by episodes of paranoia, self-destructive behavior, and eventually a complete inability to function as a king. His reign would be marked by instability and scandal on a scale that would have horrified his mother, and which can be partly attributed, though not entirely explained, by the absence of the kind of steady, loving parental presence that Louisa had been determined to provide. It is one of the great what-ifs of Danish history. Would Christian VII have been a different man if his mother had lived? Would the tragedy of his reign, the Struensee affair, the imprisonment of Caroline Matilda, the political upheavals have been avoided or mitigated if Louisa had been there to raise and guide him? These questions cannot be answered, but they haunt the history of the period. For the girls, the story was somewhat different. Sophia Magdalena, the eldest, did indeed go to Sweden. The match Louisa had so desperately opposed was eventually concluded in 1766, when Sophia Magdalena was 20 years old. She married King Gustav III of Sweden, one of the most complicated monarchs of his age, gifted, artistic, politically ambitious, personally unhappy. The marriage was, as Louisa had feared it might be, not a happy one, but Sophia Magdalena survived it, outlived her husband, and died in 1813 at the age of 67. Wilhelmina Caroline married in 1764 at the age of 17, a match that was both politically and personally more fortunate. She became the wife of the Landgrave William IX of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest princes in Europe. The marriage was happy by the standards of the time. She lived until 1820. Little Louise, the youngest, the one who barely knew her mother, married her first cousin, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel. In 1766, her mother's beloved sister Mary had moved to Denmark in 1756 to care for Louisa's children, bringing her sons with her. Charles was one of those sons. The fact that little Louise married her Aunt Mary's son means that, in some sense, the network of love that her mother and aunt had woven between them persisted into the next generation, binding the families together through the marriages of their children. And through all four of these children, and their children, and their children's children, Louisa's bloodline spread through the royal houses of Europe. Christian VII's descendants included later kings of Denmark. Sophia Magdalena's marriage to Gustav of Sweden connected the Danish and Swedish royal lines. Wilhelmina Caroline's family would intermarry with other European dynasties, and little Louisa's daughter, through her marriage to Frederick VI of Denmark, would become the grandmother of King Christian IX, the man who would be called the father-in-law of Europe, whose children and grandchildren sat on the thrones of Britain, Russia, Greece, and Denmark. In this sense, Louisa's impact on European history extended far beyond the brief 5 years of her reign. The children she bore, the connections she created through them, the dynasties she helped to found or sustain, these were a legacy of considerable scope, stretching forward through generations to touch the lives of monarchs and nations she had never imagined. We must speak at some length about the role of Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock in shaping the posthumous image of Queen Louise, because it is a story that illuminates something important about the relationship between poetry and power, between personal grief and public memory, and between the reality of a historical figure and the legend that grows up around them after their death. Klopstock was one of the great literary figures of 18th century Germany. Indeed, one of the first writers in the German language to achieve genuine international celebrity. His epic religious poem, Der Messias, the Messiah, had been an extraordinary cultural event when the first cantos appeared in 1748, bringing him fame across the German-speaking world and beyond. He was known for the emotional depth and lyrical intensity of his writing, for his ability to give voice to feelings that ordinary language could not contain. Klopstock had come to Copenhagen in 1751, invited by King Frederick, who recognized his distinction and wanted to have a great literary figure at the Danish court. He arrived in the same year that Louisa died, and the intersection of his arrival and her death gave his tribute to her a particular poignancy and sincerity. The ode he wrote, first called An den König, addressed to the king, and later revised and known as Die Königin Louisa, the Queen Louise, was an expression of genuine grief. Klopstock had not known Louisa long, but what he had seen of her in the brief months before her death had clearly affected him deeply, and the poem he wrote captured something that many people were feeling but did not have the words to express: the particular grief of losing someone too soon, someone who had not finished doing what they were capable of doing, someone whose absence left the world a diminished place. The poem was widely read and widely felt. It became part of the process by which Louisa's memory was transformed from the memory of a real woman, with real qualities and real limitations, into something closer to an ideal, a golden standard of queenship, against which all who came after would be measured. This process of idealization is not unusual. It happens with many historical figures who die young and are genuinely loved. The imperfections and complications of real life fall away, and what remains is a simplified, perfected image that speaks more to the needs of the grieving than to the reality of the person who was lost. In Louisa's case, the process was particularly marked, partly because the qualities being idealized were real. She'd genuinely been warm, culturally engaged, loved by the people, and partly because the contrast with her successors made the idealization particularly pointed. Juliana Maria, the second queen, was not a warm presence. She was formal and correct and politically calculating, and her relationship with the children of the first marriage was cool at best. The Danish people, who had loved Louisa, found Juliana Maria's manner alien and her priorities incomprehensible. In the natural human way, they remembered the first queen all the more fondly in contrast to the second. And when Caroline Matilda came to Denmark in 1766 to marry Christian VII, and when the drama of her story unfolded, the unhappy marriage, the affair with Struensee, the political coup, the arrest and exile, she too was compared unfavorably to the memory of the woman who had preceded her. The comparison was not entirely fair. The circumstances were very different, and Caroline Matilda faced challenges that Louisa had not, but it was relentless and it was damaging. In all of this, what emerges most clearly is the extraordinary degree to which Louisa's posthumous reputation stood as a kind of moral and political yardstick for the generations that followed. She was the ideal queen, the queen by whom other queens were judged. She was remembered not only as a woman, but as a symbol of what foreign-born queens could be, of what was possible when a princess chose genuinely to embrace her adopted country, of what a court could feel like when the woman at its center was warm and real and present in the lives of the people around her. It is worth pausing, in our account of Louisa's life and legacy, to consider the different ways in which her story has been received and remembered in the two countries that were most her own. In England, the land of her birth, the land of her parents and her childhood, Louisa is, by modern standards, virtually unknown. She is one of those figures who slip through the cracks of the historical record. A royal daughter who left England young and died young, who did not produce any dramatic events that would have kept her in the public consciousness of her birth country, who did not have the kind of extraordinary story, the kind of scandal or triumph or tragedy played out against the backdrop of national history that tends to be remembered. The Royal Collection in London holds several miniatures of her, delightful portraits of a young woman in the fashions of the mid-18th century. But they are not on public display. They are the property of the institution, preserved and catalogued, but not visible to the casual visitor who might chance to be curious about this princess who left England and never came back. This is something of a loss. The writers who have bothered to look at Louisa's story have found it genuinely compelling, found in it a woman of real gifts and real grace, a woman who dealt with considerable difficulties with remarkable composure, a woman who made something meaningful and lasting out of the limited tools her position and her era provided her. the Royal Central website, one of the platforms that covers British royal history in the modern era, published a substantial article about her some years ago, with the explicit observation that she was a virtually forgotten figure in Britain, overshadowed by her brilliant mother, by the more dramatic stories of other members of her family, by the simple fact that she spent the years of her adult life in a country other than the one that might have preserved her memory. In Denmark, the situation is somewhat different. She is not exactly a household name. The centuries that have passed, the distance between the mid-18th century and the present, the many other queens and kings and events that have populated Danish history since her time, all of these things mean that she does not occupy a prominent place in popular consciousness, but she is present. Her portraits hang in the Danish royal collections. Her sarcophagus rests in Roskilde Cathedral, in the chapel named for her husband. The county in Virginia that was named for her in 1742, before her marriage, still bears her name, Louisa County. And among those who study Danish history, her significance is recognized. She is understood as a transformative figure, not in the sense of having changed the political direction of the kingdom, which was not her role and was not within her power, but in the sense of having changed the cultural atmosphere and the popular perception of the monarchy. The court she helped to create was a different court from the one she had entered. The relationship between the crown and the people that she nurtured, through her language learning, her openness, her warmth, was a different kind of relationship from what had existed before. In a broader sense, she is part of a tradition of foreign-born queens who chose to make themselves truly native to their new countries, who invested themselves fully in the lives and cultures of the people they had been sent to reign beside. It is not the only way to be a queen, but it is a way that, when it works, when it is genuine rather than performative, creates something enduring and beautiful. And in Louisa's case, it worked. We have mentioned several times in the course of our story the significance of Louisa's decision to learn Danish and to raise her children in that language. But this deserves a chapter of its own, because it is perhaps the single most important thing she did, the choice that had the most lasting consequences, the act that most clearly defines her character and her values. The Danish royal court of the mid-18th century was, as we have noted, predominantly German-speaking. The Oldenburg dynasty was of German origin. The educated classes across Northern Europe communicated in German or French. The court itself had been importing German-speaking officials, courtiers, and clergy for generations. Even the king, Frederick V, was not particularly proficient in Danish, a language that his education had not thought to include. Into this environment came Louisa, who had grown up speaking English and had been educated in French and German, and who therefore had no particular reason, in terms of practical communication, to bother with Danish at all. She could have conducted her entire life at the Danish court perfectly well without ever mastering the language of the ordinary people. She chose otherwise. The historians who have written about this choice have emphasized its genuine rarity. It was not expected of foreign queens. It was not demanded. No one would have thought less of Louisa if she had been like many of her predecessors and successors, a foreign consort who remained forever slightly foreign, who operated in the language of the educated court and left Danish to the servants and the common people. But Louisa seems to have understood something important, that language is not merely a tool of communication. It is an act of identification. When you speak to someone in their own language, truly speak it with genuine effort and some degree of fluency, you are telling them something about who you are and where you place yourself in relation to them. You are saying, I take you seriously enough to meet you in your own world. I am not standing at a distance from you, behind a wall of linguistic privilege. I am here with you in the common space of shared meaning. The Danish people heard this message, felt it, and responded to it with the warmth it deserved. They heard their queen speak their language, and they understood that she had chosen them, not merely been assigned to them. They heard their queen insist that her children speak Danish, and they understood that the next generation of their royal family would be, in this most intimate of ways, genuinely theirs. This legacy of language was one that outlasted Louisa herself. Her son Christian, however troubled and however limited his effectiveness as a king, grew up speaking Danish as his primary language, a rarity among the rulers of the Oldenburg dynasty. Her daughters were raised as Danish speakers, and the expectation she had established that the royal family should speak the language of the people percolated into the culture of the court and contributed, in ways difficult to trace precisely but real nonetheless, to the evolving relationship between the Danish monarchy and the Danish people. In thinking about Louisa's linguistic legacy, it is also worth thinking about what it reveals about her character. She was not a passive person. She was not someone who simply accepted the conditions she found herself in and made the best of a bad situation. She was someone who looked at the world around her and made deliberate choices about how she was going to inhabit it. The choice to learn Danish was not forced on her. It was a choice she made freely, guided by her own instincts about what mattered and what was right. In this sense, she was very much her mother's daughter. Queen Caroline had been a woman of strong convictions who made important choices, including the choice to refuse religious conversion, the choice to involve herself in politics, the choice to use inoculation, guided by her own judgment and her own values. Louisa had imbibed from that example the understanding that a woman, even a woman in a position of limited formal power, could nevertheless make choices that mattered, and she had made hers. Among the many dimensions of Louisa's legacy, the cultural one deserves extended consideration, because in the 5 years of her reign as queen, Copenhagen experienced a genuine cultural flourishing, a period of artistic vitality that left lasting traces on Danish cultural life, and that was, in large measure, a direct consequence of the Queen's own enthusiasms and her patronage. We have already mentioned the invitation extended to Pietro Mingotti's opera company in 1747, and the arrival in Copenhagen of Christoph Willibald Gluck and Giuseppe Sarti. Let us dwell on this for a moment, because it was a significant event in the cultural history of the city. Pietro Mingotti was one of the leading impresarios of 18th century European opera, a world in which opera had become the prestige entertainment of the aristocratic and royal classes, a world in which the finest singers and the most gifted composers commanded enormous fees and travelled from court to court, bringing with them the sounds and dramas of Italian musical culture. To have a Mingotti company in residence was to signal that a court was serious about culture, that it was willing to spend money and devote attention to the highest form of entertainment available. But the presence of Gluck in particular was something remarkable. Gluck was, at the time of his Copenhagen visit, still in the early stages of a career that would eventually make him one of the most important composers of the century. He had not yet written the operas that would secure his fame. The great reform operas, beginning with Orfeo ed Euridice in 1762, that would transform the entire aesthetic of operatic writing. In 1747, he was a gifted and successful composer in the conventional style of Italian opera, but he was already someone whose talent was evident to those with ears to hear it. The fact that his path crossed with Copenhagen during Louisa's patronage of the Mingotti Company is one of those small historical coincidences that delight the historically minded. Gluck was in Copenhagen. The queen who invited him there was the queen who loved music. The opera he composed for the birth of Louisa's son, Christian, La Contessa de Numi, was one of the works that marked his time in the Danish capital, and the cultural energy that the Queen's patronage had generated was the environment in which this visit took place. The following year, 1748, brought another cultural landmark. The Den Danske Skueplads, the Danish theatre, moved into its new building. The establishment of a permanent home for theatrical performance in Copenhagen was part of the broader institutional development of Danish cultural life, and the royal family's support for this enterprise was important. Without patrons who valued the theatre, the resources necessary for its establishment and maintenance would not have been available. These cultural investments had lasting consequences. The Royal Danish Theatre that exists today, one of the oldest and most distinguished national theatres in the world, grew from the institution that was taking shape during Louisa's time. The musical tradition that flourished in Copenhagen in the mid-18th century contributed to the broader development of Danish musical culture. The patronage that the Queen extended to artists and performers created an atmosphere in which cultural excellence was valued and supported. And all of this happened because a young woman from England who happened to love music and theatre and dance with genuine passion happened to find herself as Queen of Denmark at a moment when the court was ready to embrace these pleasures, and chose to make them the centerpiece of the cultural life she was creating. Before we conclude our long and gentle journey through Louisa's life, let us spend a moment looking at the portraits that survive of her, for they tell us something about who she was and about how those who knew her saw her. The most celebrated portraits of Queen Louise are those painted by Carl Gustaf Pilo, the Swedish court painter who served at the Danish court during the reign of Frederick V. Pilo was one of the finest portrait painters of his era in Scandinavia, a master of the Rococo style that was the fashionable mode of the mid-18th century, with its characteristic combination of elegant formality and personal warmth. The most famous of Pilo's portraits of Louise is the one showing her in her coronation robes, a grand and beautiful image of a young queen in the full panoply of royal ceremonial dress, wearing the crown that had been made for her predecessor, Queen Sophie Magdalene. The painting is housed at Rosenborg Castle in Copenhagen, in the room known as Frederick V's cabinet, and it is considered one of the finest royal portraits of the period. Looking at this portrait, we can understand something of what the Swedish diplomat had meant when he described Louise as not beautiful, but very dignified. The face that looks out from Pilo's canvas is not conventionally beautiful in the manner of the idealized portraits that court painters sometimes produced. It has character rather than perfection, a face of real personality, of intelligence and warmth, and a certain quality of presence that speaks of someone who was genuinely there, genuinely engaged with the world. The eyes in the portrait are observant, looking out at the viewer with a directness that feels modern, despite the elaborate ceremonial context. This was a woman who saw things clearly, who paid attention to what was in front of her, who met the world with an open and curious gaze. Pilo painted her again in 1747, in another portrait that shows her wearing her crown. This second portrait captures something slightly different, perhaps a hint of the experience that the years between the coronation and the sitting had brought, a slight deepening of the quality that her portraits convey. Earlier portraits, miniatures painted in England before her departure for Denmark, show a younger Louise, a girl rather than a woman, her features softer, her expression more tentative. The miniatures by Christian Friedrich Zinker from the 1730s, painted when she was a child of 5 or 10 or 15, are particularly touching. A small face, looking out at us from across nearly 300 years of time, giving no indication of the life that awaited her. Her elder sister, Princess Mary, also painted Louisa as an allegory of spring, a charming miniature that was set into one of their mother's snuff boxes. The image of the youngest princess as spring, the season of new beginnings, of warmth returning after cold, of flowers opening, is one that seems fitting in retrospect. She was, for the Danish court, something like spring, the warmth that returned after the cold austerity of her father-in-law's reign, the flowers of cultural life that bloomed again when the heavy curtains of pietism were pulled back. The place where Louisa has rested for nearly 300 years deserves a chapter of its own, because it is one of the most remarkable and beautiful spaces in all of Scandinavia, and because the specific chapel in which she lies speaks to the larger historical context of her life. Roskilde Cathedral stands in the ancient royal capital of Denmark, Roskilde, which preceded Copenhagen as the centre of Danish royal life, and it has been the burial church of the Danish monarchy since the 15th century. The cathedral itself is much older than that. It was built in the 12th and 13th centuries, making it one of the earliest Gothic brick buildings in Northern Europe, and its construction in brick, rather than in the stone used for most of the great Gothic cathedrals of France and England, gave it a particular character, a warm red solidity that is distinctly Northern European. Over the centuries, as successive kings and queens required burial within the cathedral's walls, the building grew to accommodate them. Chapels were added in the architectural styles of their respective periods: Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, Neoclassical, creating a visual history of European architectural development compressed into a single extraordinary building. The result is a space unlike any other, a place where many centuries coexist, where each era has left its mark, where the accumulated weight of Danish royal history is palpable in every stone and every carved inscription. The chapel in which Louisa rests, the one known as the Frederick V Chapel, though it would not be completed until long after both she and her husband had been interred there, is in the neoclassical style, a cool and elegant space of white marble and measured proportion. Construction began in 1774 and was not completed until 1825 due to financial difficulties that interrupted the work for decades. But Louisa was placed there from the beginning, and her sarcophagus, the grand marble structure designed by Carl Frederick Stanley, the English sculptor whose nationality connects her remains with her origins, stands as one of the most significant objects in the chapel. The sarcophagus itself is a magnificent piece of craftsmanship, flanking classical figures in the tradition of European funerary sculpture, accompany a marble crown placed atop the structure, and an inscription denotes her roles as wife, mother, and queen. It is a formal memorial in keeping with the conventions of its period, but it is also a sincere one. The man who caused it to be made, Frederick V, was not indifferent to the woman he was memorializing, whatever his failures as a husband. Visitors to Roskilde today can see Louisa's tomb and can place it in the context of the extraordinary historical sequence that surrounds it. 40 monarchs resting within the walls of one cathedral, their tombs telling the story of Danish kingship across 1,000 years. To stand in that space is to feel the weight of time, the particular gravity of a place where history has settled into stone and marble and endured. And among all the tombs, Louisa's is particularly moving, not for its grandeur or its elaborateness, but for the knowledge of what it holds. A woman who died at 27, a mother of 4 small children, a queen for 5 years, someone who chose to speak the language of her adopted people, someone who filled Cole Palace rooms with music, someone who, by the account of every person who knew her, was genuinely, warmly, unperformatively good. What does the story of Princess Louisa of Great Britain, Queen Louise of Denmark and Norway, mean to us? Looking back at it from the distance of nearly 300 years, it means different things to different people, and perhaps that is appropriate for a figure whose story touches on so many of the perennial themes of human experience. For those interested in the history of European monarchy, her story illuminates the mechanics of dynastic politics in the 18th century with unusual clarity. The marriage negotiations of 1743 were not about Louisa as a person at all. They were about the balance of power in Northern Europe, about the competition between Britain and France for Danish friendship, about Christian VI's ambitions for the Swedish throne, and Frederick's need to be tamed. Louisa was the instrument through which these political calculations were enacted, a useful piece on the diplomatic board. That she became something far more than that she transcended her instrumental role and became, in her own right, a genuine cultural force and a beloved figure, is all the more remarkable for being unintended. For those interested in the history of women, her story offers a complex and nuanced portrait of a woman navigating a position of extreme constraint with considerable grace and ingenuity. She had no political power. She had no formal role in government. She could not divorce, could not leave, could not publicly protest the infidelities that must have hurt her. What she could do was choose how to inhabit the limited space she was given, and she inhabited it with a fullness and a generosity that turned constraint into something approaching freedom. For those interested in cultural history, the cultural flowering she helped to create at the Danish court, the opera companies, the theatrical support, the atmosphere of warmth and artistic engagement she generated, stands as a small but real contribution to the broader development of Danish cultural life. The Royal Danish Theatre that exists today has Louisa somewhere in its ancestry, however distant. And for those interested simply in the story of a human life, in the particular texture of a person's days and choices and loves and losses, her story offers something irreplaceable, the portrait of a real woman. Not a legend or an ideal, but a person who was born and grew up and fell in love, and had children and grieved and laughed and danced and died, leaving behind a world that was not quite the same as the one she had found. She arrived in Denmark as a stranger, carrying with her everything she had learned from her remarkable mother and a complicated family, and a country she would never see again. She left it as one of the most beloved queens it had ever known, mourned by a people who recognized in her the genuine article, someone who had chosen them as much as she had been assigned to them, someone whose presence in their lives had been a gift. That is not nothing. In fact, it is quite a great deal. In our final reflections on Louisa's life, let us consider what made her remarkable in the context of her own time, and what, if anything, makes her remarkable still. The 18th century was not, by any modern standard, an era that offered women much room to be remarkable. The formal structures of power, political, ecclesiastical, legal, economic, were all controlled by men. Women, even women of the highest birth and rank, had limited access to the levers that moved the world. A queen consort, in particular, was a figure of enormous visibility and virtually no formal authority. She was present at the center of power. She was watched and commented upon and judged, and yet she could not vote, could not legislate, could not lead armies, could not make policy. What she could do was influence. She could shape the atmosphere of the court. She could use her access to the king and to the courtiers who surrounded him to nudge things in directions she preferred. She could patron and support and encourage. She could model a certain way of being in the world that others who were watching her might learn from and imitate. Louisa used the tools available to her with uncommon skill. Her choice to learn Danish was an act of influence. It changed the relationship between the crown and the common people in ways that no formal decree could have accomplished. Her patronage of music and theatre shaped the cultural life of the court and the city. Her warm, engaged, non-hierarchical manner in personal interactions created an atmosphere of accessibility that made the monarchy feel less remote and more human. These were soft forms of power, and they were real forms of power. They may not have built empires or won wars, but they built something in many ways more durable: loyalty, affection, and the kind of deep popular identification that sustains institutions through difficult times. There is also something about Louisa that transcends the particulars of her time and speaks to something more universal. She was someone who, placed in circumstances she had not chosen and could not escape, made the best possible use of what she had been given. She did not rage against the constraints of her situation, or at least, she did not rage publicly, and there is no evidence that she raged privately in ways that affected her conduct. She accepted the marriage that had been arranged for her. She accepted the country she had been sent to. She accepted the husband who was unfaithful and the court that had initially seemed so alien. And then, having accepted all of this, she set about making it genuinely her own. This is a kind of wisdom that is not common and not easy. It requires a certain quality of spirit, the quality of being able to find genuine engagement and genuine pleasure in the life one actually has, rather than pining for a life one might have had, or waiting for conditions to improve before committing to the world in front of you. The Danish people sensed this in her, even if they could not have articulated it in quite these terms. They sensed the difference between a woman who was going through the motions and a woman who was actually present, actually engaged, actually there, and they responded to that presence with the warmth it deserved. She was 27 when she died. She had been a wife for 8 years, a queen for 5. In that time, she had done more than many monarchs accomplish in decades of formal reign. There is a small but charming footnote to Louisa's story that deserves a mention, because it reveals something about the reach of royal influence in the 18th century, and because it connects a queen who lived and died in Copenhagen to a county in the American state of Virginia that has borne her name for nearly 300 years. In 1742, a full year before Louisa's marriage to Frederick of Denmark, when she was still a young princess of 17 living in England, a new county was formed in the British colony of Virginia from the existing Hanover County. The colonial authorities, who were creating new administrative divisions, were in the habit of naming their counties after members of the British royal family, and this particular county was given the name of Princess Louise, Louisa County. The name was spelled differently from the princess's own, has existed continuously since 1742, through the colonial period, through the American Revolution, through the Civil War, through 2.5 centuries of American history. It lies in the central part of what is now the state of Virginia, not far from Richmond, and it has a county seat called Louisa in honor of its namesake. The county's residents today are largely unaware of the historical chain of events that gave their county its name. A princess who was born in London in 1724, who crossed the North Sea to marry a Danish king, who transformed the Danish court with her warmth and her love of music, who learned to speak Danish and raised her children in that language, who died at 27 and was buried in a cathedral in Roskilde. All of that history is encoded in the name of their county, preserved in the letters Louisa, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone curious enough to look. It is a small thing perhaps, but small things have a way of enduring when large things have been forgotten. And there is something touching about the thought that while Louise herself is not widely remembered in the modern world, her name is still there on the map, still present in the landscape of the country that would one day be a nation, still marking the world with her existence, 3 centuries after she breathed her first breath in a London townhouse on a cold December night. No account of Louisa's legacy would be complete without a consideration of the way her memory has functioned in the centuries since her death, particularly in relation to the queens who followed her at the Danish court. We have mentioned the contrast with Juliana Maria, the second queen, who married Frederick just 7 months after Louisa's death, and who was never able to win the kind of popular affection that her predecessor had commanded. Juliana Maria was not without her qualities. She was intelligent, politically astute, and in the years after Frederick's death in 1766, she played a significant role in the political history of Denmark, orchestrating the coup that brought down the Struensee regime in 1772 and maintaining control of the government for over a decade. She was a capable and even formidable figure, but she was not Louise. She lacked the warmth, the naturalness, the linguistic and cultural commitment that had made Louise so beloved. The Danish people never forgave her for not being Louise, and the contrast, always drawn, always unflattering to Juliana Maria, shaped public perception of her throughout her life and long after it. The case of Caroline Matilda is more complex and more poignant. She arrived in Denmark in 1766 as the wife of Christian VII, Louisa's own son, and she was, in a sense, trying to fill a role that had been defined by Louisa, without ever having known the woman who had defined it. Caroline Matilda was Louisa's niece, the daughter of Louisa's brother Frederick, Prince of Wales, and in certain ways, she resembled her aunt more than has sometimes been acknowledged. She was warm, spirited, genuinely engaged with the people around her, not well suited to the formal constraints of court life. But the circumstances she faced were very different from those Louisa had faced. Her husband, Christian VII, was mentally ill, genuinely, profoundly, increasingly obviously unwell, in ways that made the marriage a much more severe ordeal than Louisa's marriage to Frederick had been. And Caroline Matilda responded to her isolation and unhappiness in a way that Louise had not, by embarking on a passionate and scandalous affair with Johann Friedrich Struensee, the court physician, who effectively took over the government of Denmark during Christian's periods of incapacity. The affair and the political consequences that flowed from it, the coup of January 1772, Struensee's trial and execution, Caroline Matilda's imprisonment and eventual exile to Chell, where she died in 1775 at the age of 23, was one of the great scandals of 18th century European royalty, and it was inevitably compared to Caroline Matilda's disadvantage with the memory of how Louisa had handled a difficult marriage. Louisa had chosen dignity and composure. Caroline Matilda had chosen passion and defiance. Both choices were understandable. Only one was approved of. This comparison was not entirely fair to Caroline Matilda, who faced circumstances that were genuinely more extreme than Louisa's, but the comparison was made relentlessly, and it contributed to the idealization of Louisa's memory that had already been underway since Klopstock's poem. In the long perspective of history, both women deserved to be understood on their own terms, as individuals navigating impossible situations with the resources available to them. But in the shorter perspective of popular memory, Louise remains the ideal, and her successors remain the measure of how far courts can fall from grace. As we near the end of our journey through Louisa's life, let us spend a moment in reflection on the private person behind the public queen, on what we can reasonably infer about her inner life, her private feelings, her experience of joy and sorrow and love and loss. The challenge, of course, is that the historical record does not give us direct access to her private world. She left no diary, no surviving personal correspondence of any significance, no written record of her own, that would allow us to hear her voice directly. What we have are the observations of others, the Swedish diplomat's remarkable description, the accounts of Charlotte Dorothea Beale, the tribute of Klopstock, the passing references in the correspondence of courtiers and diplomats. And from these, we have to piece together a portrait of the inner woman. What emerges is a picture of someone who was fundamentally a warm and happy person, someone who found genuine pleasure in the world around her, who was not prone to melancholy or bitterness, who directed her considerable emotional energy into the things she loved rather than into complaint about the things she lacked. She loved music, and this love was not a performance or a social obligation, but a genuine passion. The image of her teaching her daughters to sing, an image preserved in the Swedish diplomat's description, is one of the most humanizing details we have, because it shows us a woman doing something for the pure pleasure of it, sharing a gift she valued with the people she most loved. She loved dance, and this too was a genuine pleasure rather than a mere accomplishment. The Queen, who was described as someone who very much enjoys dance and dances well, was someone for whom the physical experience of movement and music was a real and recurring joy. She loved the theatre and supported it with a practical generosity that went beyond mere patronage. She loved reading. She loved conversation, good conversation, on a variety of subjects, with people whose minds she respected. These loves, music, dance, theatre, books, good company, formed the private landscape of her happiness, the interior world she inhabited beneath the visible surface of queen and consort and mother. And then there were her children, the four small people who were the most immediate expression of her life's meaning. We have seen evidence of how she felt about them, the insistence on raising them herself in their own language, the decision to teach her daughters music, the fierce opposition to her daughter's arranged marriage. These were not the actions of a woman who experienced motherhood as a duty. They were the actions of someone for whom motherhood was a genuine vocation, a calling that engaged the deepest parts of herself. As for the private dimensions of her marriage, the pain of a husband's infidelities, the loneliness that must sometimes have accompanied a life spent in dignified pretense, we can only speculate. She left no record of these feelings. The public face she presented was composed and gracious. Whether there were tears behind it, whether there were moments of anger or sorrow or self-questioning that found no outlet, these are things that history cannot tell us. What history does tell us is that she made of her life something beautiful, even within its limitations, that she found a way to be genuinely present and genuinely engaged, even in circumstances that might have driven another person toward bitterness or resignation, that she loved her children and her country and her music and her dance and her conversation, and gave herself to all of these things with a generosity of spirit that was recognized and treasured by those around her. This is perhaps the most personal and the most moving dimension of her legacy, not the cultural transformation she helped to achieve, not the language she chose to speak, not the children she bore and the dynasties they founded, but simply the quality of her presence, the warmth she brought to the rooms she inhabited, the care she gave to the people around her, the way she made those who came before her feel seen and heard and valued. She was, in the end, a good person, and in the history of monarchy, where goodness is not always the most prominent quality on display, that is not a small thing to say. We have spoken often in this story about Frederick, the husband, the king, the man whose failures formed the difficult backdrop against which Louisa's grace was so clearly visible. But we owe him a more complete portrait, because he was not simply a cautionary tale or a foil. He was a real person, complicated and contradictory and, in certain important respects, genuinely significant. Frederick V was born on the 31st of March, 1723, the only surviving child of King Christian VI and his queen Sophie Magdalene. From the moment of his birth, The entire weight of dynastic expectation rested upon him. He was the heir, the only heir, the single point of continuity for the Oldenburg dynasty. This kind of pressure, which would burden any child, was made heavier by the particular character of his parents' court. Christian VI, as we have discussed, was a man of rigid religious conviction. He had made the Danish court into something approaching a monastery, a place of strict observance, minimal pleasure, and constant pious self-examination. He expected his son to share these convictions. Frederick did not, and the tension between them, between the deeply religious father and the pleasure-loving son, was one of the defining features of Frederick's youth. His education had been, by the standards of the time, thoroughly inadequate. His teachers complained that he showed no interest in learning, that he was more drawn to hunting and other physical activities than to the books and languages and history that formed the curriculum of a prince's education. He learned basic reading and writing, some French, some German, some Latin, and some history, but always reluctantly, always impatiently, always with his mind clearly elsewhere. Danish, the language of his own people, was barely taught to him at all, and he never became truly proficient in it, which makes Louisa's deliberate mastery of the language all the more striking by contrast. His personal habits, as we have noted, were problematic in the extreme. He drank heavily from a young age. He pursued romantic relationships with a promiscuity that shocked even those who were not easily shocked. He participated in the kinds of revels and excess that his father found most repugnant, and all of this was conducted with a kind of cheerful, unapologetic openness that suggested he had long since given up any pretense of meeting his father's expectations. And yet, and this is important, Frederick was not without genuine qualities. Those who knew him in his better moments described a man of real warmth and generosity, someone who was genuinely kind to those who depended on him, who could be a charming and entertaining companion when the alcohol had not yet overwhelmed his judgment, who had a natural ease in company that made him genuinely likable despite his considerable personal failures. He also had, and this is perhaps the most interesting thing about him, genuine good taste. The cultural flowering that took place during his reign was not solely the product of Louisa's influence. Frederick himself had an eye for painting, an appreciation for architecture and design, and a genuine love of music. The patronage he extended to artists and musicians reflected real aesthetic judgment, not merely the reflexive obligations of a wealthy monarch. The equestrian statue of Frederick that still stands before Christiansborg, created by the French sculptor Jacques-François Joseph Sally, and considered one of the finest equestrian portraits of the 18th century, was commissioned by the Asiatic Company of Denmark as a tribute to his reign, and it speaks to a legacy that has dimensions beyond the personal failings. His relationship with Louisa, as we have noted throughout this story, was complex. He treated her with genuine respect and even affection. He depended on her social gifts and her warmth in ways that he perhaps did not fully understand. When she died, the grief that he experienced was not merely the grief of a king who had lost a useful consort. It was the grief of someone who had lost the person who had made his daily life coherent, who had filled the court with warmth and laughter and culture, who had given him children he loved, who had been, in the only real sense that mattered, his partner. He would survive her by 14 years, dying on the 14th of January, 1766, at the age of 42. He was buried at Roskilde Cathedral, in the same chapel where Louisa had been laid to rest 15 years before. In death, they are side by side, the warm and beloved queen and the complicated, troubled king, who had been her husband, reunited in the marble stillness of the Frederick V chapel, in the place where so many Danish monarchs have found their final peace. It is, in the end, a story of two imperfect people who were bound together by the politics of their age and who made between them something that was greater than either of them alone. Frederick, for all his failures, recognized what Louisa was and valued it. Louisa, for all the difficulties he caused her, never diminished him publicly, never weaponized his weaknesses against him, never let her own dignity become a vehicle for his humiliation. They treated each other, in the deepest and most important sense, with respect, and from that respect came a reign that, for all its personal complexities, was genuinely good for the people they ruled. It is worth placing Louisa in the broader context of the women who occupied the thrones and consort chairs of 18th century Europe, because doing so allows us to understand more clearly what was distinctive about her and what was characteristic of her time. The mid-18th century produced an extraordinary generation of powerful and remarkable royal women. Catherine the Great, who became Empress of Russia in 1762, was already at work in the courts of Europe during the final years of Louisa's life. Maria Theresa of Austria, one of the most formidable rulers of the century, was navigating the war and diplomacy that would reshape the map of Europe, had been doing so since 1740, and would continue to do so until 1780. Marie Antoinette, Maria Theresa's youngest daughter, was still a child during Louisa's lifetime, but her destiny was already being shaped by the same dynastic forces that had shaped Louisa's. These women, Catherine, Maria Theresa, and the others who moved through the royal circles of 18th century Europe, were each remarkable in her own way, each responding to the constraints and opportunities of her position with her own particular combination of gifts and strategies. But most of them had something that Louisa did not: formal power. Catherine was empress in her own right. Maria Theresa was archduchess, Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, empress. Their power, however limited by the conventions of the time, was real and official. Louisa had no formal power at all. She was a queen consort, a title that, in the 18th century, meant precisely what the word consort suggests: a companion to the actual ruler, present at the center of power, but possessing none of it. She could not legislate. She could not command. She could not make policy or declare war or sign treaties. Her role was ceremonial, social, and, most importantly in the dynastic sense, reproductive. And yet, she accomplished things. Not the grand political accomplishments of a Catherine or a Maria Theresa, but real things nonetheless. She changed the atmosphere of a court. She built a bridge between a foreign crown and its native people. She created a cultural legacy that outlasted her. She raised children who would shape the future of Northern Europe. The comparison with other foreign-born queens of her era is also instructive. Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha had married Louisa's brother Frederick, Prince of Wales, in 1736, and she had navigated the peculiarly difficult position of Princess of Wales in a court where her husband was perpetually at odds with the king. Augusta's approach was very different from Louisa's, more politically active, more ambitious, more focused on building a political faction around herself and her husband. She was in many ways a more formally influential figure than Louisa, but her popularity with the people was never quite the warm, genuine thing that Louisa achieved in Denmark. Then there was Caroline Matilda, Louisa's niece, the daughter of Louisa's brother Frederick, born in the very month that Louisa died, and eventually brought to Denmark as Christian VII's queen. Caroline Matilda's story is the tragic inverse of Louisa's. She came to Denmark young, as Louisa had. She found a difficult husband, as Louisa had. But where Louisa had responded with composure and dignity, Caroline Matilda responded with passion and defiance, with consequences that were catastrophic. The contrast between them was the talk of the courts of Europe for decades. What made Louisa different? What allowed her to navigate her difficult circumstances with the grace that others found impossible? Part of the answer lies in temperament. She was by nature a more equable and socially gifted person than many of her contemporaries, possessed of a warmth and an ease in company that made difficult social situations manageable in ways they were not for others. Part of it lies in her upbringing. The example of her remarkable mother, Queen Caroline, had given her a template for how a woman could exercise real influence through soft power, through relationships and culture and social presence, without needing formal authority to do it. And part of it, perhaps, lies in the particular quality of her attachment to Denmark. She genuinely chose her adopted country. She genuinely learned its language and embraced its culture and made it her own. This was not performance, it was real, and it made the difference between a queen who was tolerated and a queen who was loved. Let us, in these final passages before our story reaches its conclusion, spend one more chapter inside the world of Christiansborg Palace during the years of Louisa's queenship, because this was the place where she spent most of her adult life, and because understanding it helps us understand the scale and the texture of what she created there. Christiansborg in the 1740s and 1750s was a magnificent building, the newest and grandest royal palace in Denmark, completed under Christian VI, and still carrying that quality of freshness that new buildings possess before the weight of time settles upon them. It was enormous, hundreds of rooms arranged around a central courtyard with wings extending in multiple directions, with a chapel and a theatre and stables, and all the apparatus of a full royal establishment. The rooms were decorated in the style of the period. Rich fabrics, elaborate plasterwork, gilded furniture, paintings on every wall, chandeliers of rock crystal and gilded bronze casting their warm light over the gatherings that took place beneath them. In winter, when the short northern days made outdoor life impractical and the social season at its height, the great halls of Christiansborg became the backdrop for the court life that Louisa had made her own. The balls that had resumed after the death of the austere Christian VI were among the most brilliant social events in Northern Europe, occasions at which the court assembled in its finest clothes, at which music filled the gilded rooms, at which the elaborate formal dances of the period were performed with the precision and grace that months of practice could achieve. Louisa presided over these occasions with the ease that was her particular gift. She had an almost miraculous ability to make large formal gatherings feel warm and human, to move through a room and leave each person she spoke with feeling that they had been genuinely attended to, genuinely seen. The Swedish diplomat's description captures this quality precisely. She seldom leaves anyone without saying something nice. This was not mere politeness. It was a genuine engagement with each individual, a real interest in what they had to say, an authentic warmth that people felt and responded to. The balls at Christiansborg were also occasions for music on a grand scale. The Royal Orchestra, the Kongelige Kapell, the Royal Chapel musicians played for these events, and under Louisa's patronage, the quality and the ambition of the musical program had risen considerably from what it had been in the stern years of the old reign. The Italian operas performed under her patronage, the concerts organized at her initiative, the musicians recruited to Copenhagen at her invitation. All of these things had raised the musical standard of the court to something genuinely distinguished. But the most intimate and revealing musical moments were not the grand public ones. They were the smaller gatherings in the Queen's own apartments, the evenings when a group of musicians would play in one of the inner rooms, with the Queen and a small circle of companions present, and the music would be for pleasure rather than ceremony. These were the evenings that Louisa loved best, that she organized most carefully, that she participated in most actively. sometimes listening, sometimes playing herself, always fully present in the music in a way that the great public occasions could not quite allow. The theatrical performances that had been banned under Christian VI were also restored under Louisa's influence. The Danish theatre, the national theatre that had been struggling for recognition and resources, received the royal patronage that helped it establish itself as a genuine institution. Performances of both Danish works and translated pieces from the European repertoire were staged for the court, and Louisa attended with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who loved the theatre for its own sake, not merely as a social obligation. It was in the theatre, perhaps more than anywhere else, that the transformation of the court was most visible. A court that had banned theatrical performance for years, that had treated drama as a morally suspect form of entertainment unworthy of royal patronage, was now one in which the theatre was celebrated and supported and attended by the Queen herself with evident delight. This was not a small change. It was a statement about the kind of court it was going to be. Open, generous, engaged with the full range of human creative expression, not afraid of beauty or pleasure, or the complicated emotions that good theatre evokes. Through all of these rooms, the grand ballrooms and the intimate music rooms, the formal reception chambers and the private apartments, the theatre and the chapel and the gardens visible through the tall windows, Louisa moved with the ease of someone who had made this enormous, complicated place genuinely her home. She had arrived as a stranger, not speaking the language, not knowing the customs, not understanding the rhythms of the place. 8 years later, she was at the center of it all, the person around whom everything organized itself, the warmth that kept the whole great machine of the court human. It is one of the quiet miracles of her story, how completely she had made herself at home in a world that had once been entirely foreign to her, how fully she had become Danish, how genuinely she had belonged. Throughout our story, we have returned again and again to the figure of Princess Mary, Louisa's beloved sister and closest friend. Now, as we draw our account toward its close, let us spend a moment with Mary, because she is herself a remarkable figure, and because the story of the two sisters illuminates something important about the bonds of family that sustain people through the dislocations of royal life. Mary of Great Britain, Princess Mary, who would become the Landgravin of Hesse Castle, was born in 1723, making her roughly a year and a half older than Louisa. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable warmth and vitality, a person who shared with her youngest sister that natural ease in company and that love of the arts that had characterized the children of Queen Caroline. She had a particular gift for painting. She had trained with skilled instructors and produced work of real quality, and a love of music that echoed Louisa's own. The two sisters had grown up together in the inner circle of the royal family. The younger set, born in London, raised in Leicester House, and then at St. James's Palace and Richmond Lodge. They had shared nurses and governesses and tutors, had sat together in their mother's apartments and absorbed the same lessons from that remarkable woman, had been together through the grief of their mother's death and the years that followed. Their friendship was not merely sisterly affection, it was the friendship of two people who had known each other from the very beginning, who had shared a formative world. When Louisa left for Denmark in 1743, the separation from Mary was one of the hardest things about the journey. The two sisters maintained contact through correspondence, the great medium of friendship across distance in the 18th century, the letters that crossed the North Sea carrying news and affection, and the particular intimacy of written words between people who loved each other. In 1743, the same year as Louisa's marriage, Mary married Frederick II, Landgrave of Hesse Castle. The marriage was, by most accounts, not a happy one. Friedrich was not an easy husband, and the relationship deteriorated to the point where Mary was eventually effectively estranged from him, living separately from the man she had been married to and building a life as independent as her circumstances permitted. It was this estrangement that eventually brought Mary to Denmark in 1756, 5 years after Louisa's death. She came because her sister's orphan children needed someone who loved them, someone who knew them, someone who could provide the kind of warm family connection that their father's difficult second wife was not providing. And she came with her sons, 4 boys who would grow up at the Danish court, alongside their Danish cousins, weaving together the two families in ways that would eventually be formalized through marriage. The fact that Mary came, that she uprooted herself from whatever life she had built and crossed to Denmark to care for her sister's children, tells us everything we need to know about the bond between them. It was a bond that outlasted Louisa's life. It was a bond strong enough to compel action years after the person who had created it was gone. It was the kind of bond that only comes from years of genuine closeness, of shared experience, of being known by another person in the deepest sense of the word. And in caring for Louisa's children, Mary kept something of Louisa alive in the world. She knew the children's mother. She could tell them stories, share memories, provide a living connection to the woman they had lost before they were old enough to remember her. She could look at little Christian and see something of Louisa in his face. She could sit with little Louise, the one who had barely had a year with her mother, and give her, in however partial and surrogate a way, the female presence she had missed. This is one of the most moving dimensions of Louisa's posthumous story, the way in which the love she had inspired in life continued to organize the actions of those who had loved her long after she was gone. Mary came to Denmark for Louisa's children. Klopstock wrote his poem for Louisa's memory. Frederick, in whatever complicated and inadequate way he was capable, grieved for Louisa's loss. The Danish people remembered Louisa when they evaluated her successors. Love, it seems, does not require the presence of the person who inspired it to continue doing its work in the world. It continues quiet and insistent, shaping actions and feelings and choices long after the person at its center has passed beyond the reach of the ordinary world. This is Louisa's truest and most enduring legacy. Not a tomb or a poem or a county in Virginia, but the love she inspired, still working in the world, years and decades after she was gone. Every historical life presents us with the same paradox. The version of a person that history preserves is inevitably a selection, a partial truth, a photograph taken from one angle that misses everything outside its frame. For Louisa, the historical record is particularly limited. She was not a woman who wrote, or if she wrote, her personal papers have not survived in any significant quantity. She did not produce the kind of documentary trail that would allow us to hear her voice directly. No diaries, no personal correspondence of note, no memoirs or reflections. What we have are the observations of others, the official records of a court and a reign, the portraits that painters made of her, and the testimony of people who knew her, testimony that is always filtered through the observer's own interests and limitations. From these fragmentary sources, we have tried in this long night's journey to reconstruct something of the person she was, the warm, musical, dance-loving, language-learning young woman who crossed the North Sea at 18 and built a life in a foreign country with extraordinary grace. We have tried to give her back her particularity, her individuality, her humanity, to see her not merely as a historical figure or a dynastic asset, but as a person who experienced the full range of what it means to be alive. But we must also acknowledge what we cannot know. We cannot know what she really thought of Frederick, whether the dignified silence she maintained was the product of genuine equanimity or of a suppressed anguish that found no external expression. We cannot know whether she had moments of longing for England, for the life she had left behind, for her sister Mary and the world of her girlhood. We cannot know whether the warmth she brought to every public encounter reflected an equally warm inner life, or whether it required effort, the effort of a woman who had learned to be warm because warmth was useful, necessary, strategically important. These questions are unanswerable, and we must hold them as questions rather than filling them in with the answers that would make the story most satisfying. Louisa was a complex human being, and complex human beings resist the tidy narratives that biography is always tempted to impose. What we can say with some confidence is this: she was good at living. She had a genuine capacity for pleasure and for engagement that served her well in a life that offered real difficulties alongside its considerable privileges. She found joy in music and dance and good conversation, and her children, and the long summer evenings at Fredensborg. She found meaning in the work of learning Danish and raising her children in that language, and building a relationship between the crown and the people that was warmer and more genuine than what had existed before her arrival. And she left the world at 27, having done more with her years than most people accomplish, in twice or 3 times as many. That is not nothing. In fact, measured against the scale of a human life, it is quite a great deal. The world she left behind was not the same world she had found. Copenhagen's court was different, more open, more warm, more culturally alive. The relationship between the Danish monarchy and the Danish people was different, more personal, more genuine, informed by the example of a queen who had chosen to speak their language and raise her children as one of them. The cultural institutions she had patronized and supported were stronger than they had been. The memory she left behind was golden enough to serve as a standard for decades. These are real things, small, perhaps, on the scale of history. She did not change borders, or make peace, or fight wars, or write great books, or paint great paintings. But she changed the atmosphere of a court. She changed the relationship between a crown and its people. She changed the culture of a place. And sometimes the atmosphere is everything. And so we come, my dear sleepy listener, to the end of our journey through the life of Princess Louisa of Great Britain, Queen Louise of Denmark and Norway. We have followed her from her first breath in Leicester House on a December evening in 1724, through the warm and intellectually vibrant world of her English childhood, through the loss of her remarkable mother, through the political negotiations that set her course for Denmark, through the extraordinary sea voyage and the Proxy wedding, and the first meeting with the man she was to marry. We have walked with her through the cold corridors of the Beatrice court she entered as a young crown princess, watched her learn the language of her adopted people, seen her gradually and deliberately transform herself from a foreign stranger into a beloved Danish queen. We have heard the music that filled Christiansborg's halls when she arrived, have seen the iron chains come down and the palace doors open, have watched the opera companies arrive and the theatre flourish, and the court come alive with a warmth it had not possessed for years. We have met her children, little Sophia Magdalena, little Wilhelmina, little Christian, little Louise, and have felt the particular tenderness of a mother who was determined to give them the kind of loving presence that she herself had briefly known before losing it. We have accompanied her through the strains of a marriage that was not a love story, but became, in its quiet way, a partnership of genuine respect and mutual dependence. We have seen her handle with extraordinary dignity the situations that might have broken someone of lesser spirit. We have heard the Swedish diplomat's description and understood, through his words, the woman she was: warm, easy, clever, musical, dancing, good, and we have been with her at the end. the birthday that became her last, the winter that did not release her, the death that came too soon, and the funeral that carried her to Roskilde, and the tomb where she has rested through the long centuries in the company of the Danish kings and queens among whom she chose to make her home. What remains of her 3 centuries later? The portraits in the royal collection and the Danish galleries, the sarcophagus in Roskilde Cathedral, the county in Virginia that still carries her name, the memory, among those who have troubled to look, of a woman who was given a limited life and filled it with extraordinary grace, and perhaps something less tangible but more enduring than any of these, the echo of a choice, the echo of a young woman of 18, stepping off a boat in a foreign country and deciding, not because anyone required it of her, not because it would bring her any political advantage, but because she meant it, to speak the language of the people around her, to raise her children in that language, to make this strange country her own. That choice reverberates still, in ways that cannot quite be measured or traced, in the relationship between a monarchy and its people, in the idea that royalty can choose to be genuinely native to the land it rules, in the simple and powerful truth that when those who hold power choose to learn the language of those they serve, when they choose to meet others in the common space of shared meaning, something good happens, something lasting is built. Louisa built it, Denmark remembered it, and we, looking back across the centuries, can see it still. The particular light of a life lived with genuine generosity and genuine grace, shining quietly through the darkness of time. Let us also remember, as we let our eyes close and our breathing slow, the particular quality of her courage, for courage is the right word, even if it was not the dramatic battlefield kind. It takes courage to leave everything you know at 18 and step into a life that is entirely unfamiliar. It takes courage to smile and engage and be warm when the man beside you is not being faithful, when the court around you is watching for weakness, when the people whose language you are struggling to learn are assessing whether you are worthy of their affection. It takes a quiet, daily, persistent courage to maintain the composure and the warmth and the dignity that Louisa maintained year after year through all the small and large difficulties of her life. She was not a saint, and we should not turn her into one. She was a human being, a young woman who must have had her moments of fear and loneliness and self-doubt, who must sometimes have missed England and her sister Mary and the familiar world of her girlhood, who must sometimes have been tired of the performances that royal life demanded. But whatever her private moments of difficulty, she found her way back, day after day, to the warmth and the engagement and the genuine presence that made her what she was. This quality, this capacity for daily renewal, for returning again and again to one's best self after whatever private storms had buffeted the night, is one of the most underrated forms of human excellence. We celebrate the grand gestures, the dramatic moments, the acts of obvious courage, but the quiet, persistent daily choice to be good, to be warm, to be present, to be the kind of person whose company lifts those around her. This is perhaps the most important kind of excellence and the hardest to sustain. Louisa sustained it for 8 years in Denmark, through winters and summers and births and deaths, and all the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a life. And when it ended, the people who had been warmed by it knew what they had lost. There is a moment described in one of the historical accounts of Louisa's final days that I want to share with you, my dear sleepy listener, as we come to the very end of our journey together. It is a small moment, and not dramatic in any conventional sense, but it has stayed with me in the months of reading and thinking about this story, and I think it may stay with you too. In the autumn of 1751, as Louisa's health was deteriorating and the shadow of the illness that would kill her was becoming more present, she was still engaged with the daily life of the court, still receiving visitors, still attending to the business of being queen, still present in the rooms of Christiansborg in the way that she had always been present. And one of her ladies-in-waiting, in a letter written some years later, described finding the queen in her private apartment one afternoon with her youngest daughter, little Louise, who was not yet 2 years old. Sitting in her lap, the queen was singing to her, not one of the grand Italian opera pieces that the court had been enjoying, not one of the formal court songs, just a simple song, gentle and quiet, the kind of song a mother sings to a small child in the afternoon when the world is still and no one is watching. That image, the queen, already ill, already carrying the weight of everything she was carrying, singing softly to her youngest daughter in the afternoon light, is one that seems to me to capture something essential about who she was. Not the queen on the throne, not the queen at the ball, not the queen receiving diplomats or patronizing opera companies or transforming courts. Just a mother with her child, singing, being warm, being present, being, in the most fundamental and irreducible sense, herself. She had 3 months to live when that scene took place. Her youngest daughter would grow up without remembering her. But in that moment, in that room, in that quiet afternoon song, Louisa was entirely and completely there. And that, in the end, is what her story is about. Not the grand historical forces that shaped her path, not the dynastic politics that carried her from London to Copenhagen, not the cultural legacy she left behind. Though all of these things matter and are real, it is about the quality of her presence, the way she was in the rooms she inhabited, the warmth she brought to each encounter, each relationship, each ordinary moment of an extraordinary life. That is the thing that cannot be taken from her. The portraits may fade, the tomb may one day crumble. Even the county's name for princesses may eventually be renamed. But the warmth she brought into the world, the specific, particular, irreplaceable quality of being Louisa, that was real while it existed, and the people who felt it were changed by it, in ways that rippled outward through the years and decades and centuries that followed. We are the inheritors of those ripples, even if we do not always know it. The world we live in was shaped, in ways too numerous and too subtle to trace, by the choices of people like Louisa, people who chose warmth over coldness, engagement over distance, genuine presence over performance. Their choices accumulated over centuries into the world we have now. And so, in some very small and very real way, we owe her something. Not a monument or a memorial, she has those, but attention. The attention we have given her tonight, following her through the rooms and the seasons and the years of her life, listening to her story with the care and the quiet that she deserved and rarely received from the great world that surrounded her. You have given her that attention tonight, dear listener. You have spent these hours in her company, and in doing so, you have participated in the act of remembrance that keeps the quiet, good people of history alive in the world, not in the grand, dramatic way of heroes and villains, but in the gentle, persistent, intimate way of stories told in the dark to people who are on the edge of sleep. This is how history lives, not in textbooks or monuments, but in nights like this one, in the warmth of a story, in the sound of a narrator's voice moving through the dark, in the connection between a person who lived 3 centuries ago and a listener who is alive and breathing and present in this very moment. Louisa lived. She was real. She mattered. And tonight, she has been here with us. Sleep well, my dear listener. May the gentle story of this remarkable young queen accompany you into peaceful dreams. Carry her with you tonight, into the quiet places where history and sleep become one, and rest easy in the knowledge that the world has been graced by people like her. She deserved more years than she was given, but she made glorious use of the ones she had, and we are richer for having known her story. Before you drift off completely, dear friend, I want to take just a moment to say something from the heart. These stories, the quiet stories of people who lived centuries before us, who walked through their days with the same mixture of joy and sorrow and love and loss that we walk through ours. These stories matter. They matter because they remind us that we are part of something larger than our own moment, that the choices we make, the languages we learn, the warmth we bring to our relationships, the way we inhabit the lives we have been given, these things echo forward in time in ways we cannot always see or predict. Louisa of Great Britain could not have known that 3 centuries later, someone would be sitting in the warm dark of their bedroom or curling up under a blanket somewhere in the world, listening to her story. But her story is worth telling and worth hearing because she was real and she was good, and she chose, again and again, to be fully present in the life that was hers to live. She was a princess who became a queen. She was a stranger who became a native. She was a young woman sent across the sea to marry someone she had never met, who arrived in a country she had never visited, speaking a language she had never learned, and she made of all of that something warm and lasting, and genuinely her own. She filled palace halls with music. She spoke to ordinary people in their own language. She held her children in her lap and sang to them in the long afternoon light. She was kind to the people around her, day after day, in the ordinary, persistent way that is the most demanding kindness of all. We have been in her company tonight for a long and peaceful journey. We have watched her grow from a child in Leicester House to a princess in St. James's Palace, from a young bride on the HMY Fubs to a crown princess at Charlottenburg, from a new queen receiving her coronation at Fredericksburg to a beloved monarch whose death plunged an entire nation into genuine grief. We have felt the weight of all she carried and the lightness she nevertheless managed to bring to those around her. We have understood, I hope, why she is worth remembering, not because she changed the course of history in any dramatic way, but because she showed what one person, in a limited role, with limited formal power, can accomplish through the simple exercise of warmth and genuine humanity. That lesson does not belong only to queens. It belongs to all of us, to everyone who finds themselves in a situation not entirely of their choosing, navigating relationships that are complicated, building a life in conditions that are not ideal. The example of Louisa is not an example of perfect circumstances or extraordinary formal power. It is an example of what is possible when a person chooses, deliberately and persistently, to be present and warm and genuine in whatever world they inhabit. Carry that with you tonight, dear listener, as you drift towards sleep. Let it be the last thought of the evening, that warmth matters, that presence matters, that the daily choice to meet the world with openness and genuine care is not a small thing. It is perhaps the most important thing. If you enjoyed tonight's journey with Louisa, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more dreamers find their way to Sleepy Crown, and that is always a good thing. Leave a comment telling me which moment in Louisa's story touched you most. Was it the language she chose to learn? The music she brought to Copenhagen? The children she loved so fiercely? The quiet dignity with which she faced the difficult parts of her life? Or perhaps the image of her singing softly to her youngest daughter in an afternoon room, months before the end? I would love to know which moment stayed with you. And if you are not yet part of the Sleepy Crown family, please subscribe. New stories are always on the way, new lives waiting to be gently told, new quiet histories ready to carry you toward rest. We are always here, in the dark, with a story and a soft voice and all the time you need. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well. And thank you, as always, for spending your quiet hours here with us. Sweet dreams.